Hey guys, welcome to my channel. Today we are going to be going to What If the Asshole Pirates Didn't Split Part 5. Make sure to like and subscribe, it helps, and it means the world to me. Also join the Discord. Disclaimer. There may be mature content and maybe 18 plus content, and I don't own this story, and link to the author down below. Go check them out. With that stuff out of the way, let's begin chapter 41. Calming Constellations. Another nightmare. Ace grumbled out as he slowly woke back up for the third time to shaking at his side. They've been pretty bad since you got hurt, Sabo answered softly, equally groggy as he tried waking Luffy from whatever terrors were happening in his brother's dreams. Yesterday had been long, boring, and stressful. Being in the infirmary again brought back many painful, unwanted memories for the brothers, but there was no getting around it. They weren't going to leave Ace, and they weren't going to just walk out and risk the wrath of a nurse, so they opted to stay in the terror-inducing room. Seeing as this was the case, Luffy's sleep had been riddled with nightmares once again, both due to the smells in the room and the memories, but also because of the trauma of Ace's attack. The youngest was sharing a bed with Ace, refusing to leave his brother's side in fear that he'd wake up and the wave would be transparent again. Whenever a nightmare came on, though, Sabo would hear it and wake up first, tasking himself with waking the boy up before the nightmare could get any worse and, in the process, wake Ace up as well. "Come on Lu, wake up, it's just another nightmare," Sabo said, a yawn coming out mid-sentence. "Luffy, wake you, Ace groaned out. He loved his little brother, he did, but this was the third time he was being rudely awoken, and he just wanted to go back to sleep. He didn't blame the boy though, after all, he had no control over his dreams. "Lu, wake up," Sabo said in a much more soothing voice than Ace's had been, gently shaking him as he did. Finally, Luffy woke up, his breathing a bit heavy and fast, eyes opening slowly at first before they went wide, and he was sitting upright as quick as lightning. Sabo had no warning besides past experience, and was lucky enough to move away from him, before he ended up being headbutted by the terrified Luffy. "Attaboy," Ace mumbled out, rubbing his eyes as he sat up a bit, ignoring the slight sting from his injury. "Calm down Lu, everything's fine, we're still right here," Sabo soothed, rubbing his brother's back in hopes that it would calm him down faster. It was still pitch black outside, indicating that not much time had passed since the last nightmare, and it was still late at night. Sabo was really hoping that this would be the last nightmare of the night, but knew that that was unlikely. "Sorry," Luffy said quietly, relaxing a bit as he became more aware of what had happened. "It's fine Lu, it wasn't your fault," Sabo said, yawning again at the end, as he felt his eyelids droop a bit. "Do you want to go sit out on deck for a minute? It might calm you down a little faster," Sabo suggested, glancing to see that Ace was already passed out again. Luffy hummed, lifting the blanket and getting out of bed. He shivered at the harsh contrast of the cold air compared to the warm bed, and Sabo, having noticed, grabbed the blanket off his bed. "Come on, I'll keep an ear on Ace while we sit," Sabo said, wrapping the blanket around Luffy's shoulders and taking his hand. Luffy nodded again, holding the blanket tight with his free hand, and allowing Sabo to lead him out of the smelly infirmary, nose twitching in pain from the burning smell. Like the infirmary, it was pitch dark in the halls, making it difficult for Sabo to see where they were trying to go, but he managed, keeping a hand on the wall to orient himself, and walking towards the light seeping under the door at the end of the hallway. Once reaching it, Sabo pushed it open, revealing the deck, and a quick listen told him that there were only those in the crow's nest and 4 patrolling the railings. Because of this, and not wanting to get in the way, Sabo led Luffy beside the door, against the wall, and sat down, both looking up at the dark sky. The moon was full and lit the entirety of the deck up with ease. Stars were littered across the sky as well, and there were only a few small clouds drifting along slowly, the wind almost non-existent. It was a quite peaceful night. "I like the stars," Luffy said softly, not daring to speak too loud. Even the soft way he spoke though sounded loud and clear to Sabo, with or without his sensitive hearing. "I do too." "Hey, did you know that the stars form pictures in the sky?" Sabo asked, both trying to keep himself awake as well as calm Luffy. "Really?" the boy asked in wonder, glancing at his brother and then back to the sky with interest, trying to see what Sabo meant. "That's right, they're called constellations," Sabo said, also looking back up to the sky, trying to find one. "Like right there, that one's Gemini, the sign of twins. If you look, it kind of looks like 2 people holding hands," Sabo explained, pointing out the stars as best he could to Luffy. It took him a minute, but eventually, Luffy smiled brightly, turning to Sabo. "I see it." After that, Sabo spent a few minutes just pointing out different constellations for Luffy, both of them being careful to be quiet so they didn't disturb anyone. At one point, one of the pirates patrolling the deck noticed them, but he merely smiled and waved to them before continuing on, the brothers waving back as he did. While Luffy yawned, Sabo decided that they should probably head back to the infirmary to try and get a little bit more sleep, Luffy begrudgingly agreeing and standing, following Sabo back and scrunching his nose at the wave of smell that assaulted his nose as they entered. "Where'd you guys go?" Ace slurred out, sounding like he was just waking up again. "We went and sat out on deck for a bit." We're gonna try and get some more sleep, but could you tell us how to get back to the beds? I'd really rather not knock over everything in this room trying to get there myself. Sabo said, glancing around blindly in the darkness. It had been easier to get out because of the small amount of light under the door, but now they were heading into the room where there wasn't a single speck of light to help them. Yeah, just as walk forward. Ace instructed, moving from the sounds of it. Sabo did as he was told, Luffy holding onto his hand as they followed the instructions until Ace told them to stop, his voice now directly on their left. Alright, turn left, keep going, stop, turn a little more right, yeah, okay, now just walk forward. If you put your hands out you'll feel the beds. Ace said, a little more awake now. After a few seconds, Sabo was climbing back into his bed, sighing happily at the warmth that encompassed him, while Luffy crawled back into bed with Ace, giving Sabo back his blanket. Night guys, Sabo said, already closing his eyes and falling back asleep. Night. Ace and Luffy chorused back, both of them snuggling up together as they too fell asleep. By the time morning rolled around, Luffy had only had one more nightmare, much less than Sabo and Ace had been expecting. It was before breakfast, but not by much, and whiskey was on her way, Sabo hearing that she was coming to see how Ace was doing. When she walked in, Sabo and Luffy were sitting in the chairs by Ace's bed, Sabo having had to persuade Luffy to leave the bed, so whiskey could check on Ace. Good morning you three, how are all of you today? She asked, smiling sweetly to them. Sabo smiled back, resisting the urge to shiver at the smile. We're doing well, thank you. What about you? Sabo asked politely, forcing himself to continue smiling. Whiskey made her way over to Ace, holding a roll of bandages in one hand and her clipboard in the other. About the same. Now, let's see how that injury of yours is. Whiskey said, sitting on her rolly's stool and beginning to gently unwrap Ace's bandages, showing them all that the once huge red wound was now a thin, nearly gone line across his chest. It seems much better now. Everything looks to be healing correctly, and no infections, so that's good. I think all we need now is to rewrap it, and by tomorrow it'll be gone. Whiskey said as she inspected the cut, scanning over it carefully, as if something would pop out to her and explain the fast healing. When will he be able to leave? Sabo asked, trying to be as polite as possible without showing just how bad they wanted out of the infirmary they worked so hard to stay away from. I think if everything's still alright after breakfast, then Ace here should be all clear to leave. I do want you to come back tomorrow though, so I can remove the bandages and rewrap them if necessary. Whiskey informed, looking to Ace at the last bit. Before allowing Ace to bite back something, Sabo answered for him, smiling once more. Thank you Whiskey, we'll be sure to come by tomorrow then. He said, wanting the interaction to be over now. The nurse nodded, quickly rewrapping the injury with practiced ease before sliding back from the bed and standing. Well, that should be by soon with breakfast. Once you're finished I'll come by as well and we can work on getting you out of here. Whiskey said, writing on her clipboard. Sabo nodded, thanking the nurse one more time, and she left the brothers. Man, I can't wait to get out of here. Ace groaned, stretching his arms out, pleased to feel that the once sharp sting was now dull and bearable. The sooner we're out the better. Sabo agreed, glancing around. Yesterday there had been a few whitebeards in here, all of them getting checkups from Whiskey before leaving, but today there was no one, although it was still a bit early. The only people there were the brothers, Whiskey, and a few other nurses that the brothers were sure to keep a close eye on. A yawn from Ace reminded Sabo and Luffy just how tired they were, all their nights having been pretty rough with the nightmares that they all had had, Luffy especially. Maybe we should take a nap later. Ace said after he yawned once more, immediately after the first one. Sabo, unable to resist yawning himself, looked at Ace with a bit of a smile. We've barely been up for half an hour, and you're already scheduling nap time, Sabo said with a hint of teasing in his voice, though he agreed with Ace. So what if I am, according to the nurses here, I need all the rest I can get, so ha. Ace said triumphantly, crossing his arms and sticking his tongue out at Sabo, who rolled his eyes. Luffy laughed, feeling the playfulness coming from both of his brothers. You three are lively today. Thatch's voice made the three turn, mouths salivating at the sight and smell of the food. It was well Thatch, Sabo said as he took the platter from the chef, divvying up the food for the three, and handing his brothers the platter to split, while he took a much smaller bowl. I guess you're right. Today's a good day, I can feel it. Thatch said confidently, taking his seat by Ace's bed. Oh, what makes you say that? Sabo asked curiously, beginning to eat one of his muffins. Thatch's smile widened, hands behind his head. Well, I just found out we're nearing Sabati. Shouldn't be too long now, maybe 3 days. Thatch said, looking at the ceiling. Shabby? Luffy questioned a bit softly from the bed, watching the chef with a curious gaze. Sabati Luffy, Sabati, Sabo said slowly, Luffy repeating the word back successfully to him. Oh yeah, I always forget you three don't know these things. Sabati's basically the halfway point to many pirates. It's at the end of paradise and after you pass it you've reached the new world. Thatch explained with a smile. Looks like you like the island. Ace observed from where he watched, shoving food into his mouth. The chef sighed a bit, shrugging. It has its ups and downs, that's for sure. As long as we stay away from groves 1 to 29 and 60 to 69 it's pretty nice, he said, frowning a bit. Groves? Ace asked, confused now. Yeah, the entire island is actually a giant forest of mangrove trees that are separated into different districts, groves 1 to 29, the Lawless Zone, 30 to 39, the amusement park, 40 to 49, the tourist areas, 50 to 59, the shipping areas, 60 to 69, marine headquarters, and 70 to 79 the hotel town. Thatch explained, ticking off the different sections on his fingers. The brothers shivered though at the sound of the marine headquarters, and it seemed Thatch was thinking the same thing as them at that moment, as he frowned as well. Come to think of it, we should definitely stay far away from 60 to 69 this time, he muttered as if more to himself. The brothers couldn't help but find themselves nodding in agreement. Anyways, the island's actually pretty nice if you stay within the tourist sections. There's a wide variety of things you can get there because it's so popular. We wouldn't be there long, just long enough for our ship to get coated, and then we'll head to Fishman Island. Thatch finished, the brothers finishing their food as well. Even though Sabo had more questions, like what ship coating meant, he held them off for now, just wanting out of the infirmary as fast as possible. Well, it sounds lovely. Thank you for the breakfast, Thatch, Sabo said with a smile, placing his empty bowl on the cleared platter and handing it back to the chef. Thatch smiled brightly, taking the platter from the blonde. Oh, it was no problem. Hope you get better soon, Ace, Thatch said, waving goodbye to the brothers as he began to leave the room. Whiskey, noticing they were done with breakfast, made her way over and performed one last exam on Ace, to make sure he was healed enough to leave. Once deemed healthy enough she allowed them to leave, the brothers having to hold themselves back from bolting out of the room. Thank Kami were finally out of there. Ace huffed out, glaring over his shoulder at the infirmary door. Luffy and Sabo both nodded their agreement as they stood in the hallway, contemplating what to do next. We could go sit out on deck, Sabo offered, but even he didn't really want to do that. I think we should take a break from sitting out there, bad things keep happening whenever we do, Ace grumbled, Sabo nodding his agreement once more. Then what should we do? Luffy asked, shifting his weight as he waited. Ace and Sabo looked to the boy, then to each other, and then shrugged. Why don't we walk around for a bit? There's still a lot we haven't seen on this ship, I'm sure, Sabo suggested, looking down the hall leading further into the ship, rather than out onto the deck. I'm fine with that, Ace agreed. Yeah, let's explore, Luffy said enthusiastically, his mood increasing in positivity now that they were free from the smelly infirmary. Well then, let's go, Sabo said, turning to begin walking down the hall. Luffy cheered and ran up to his side, Ace sighing as he followed as well. Now that they weren't trying to hide or sneak around, walking around the inside of the Moby was much more peaceful and relaxing for the three. They didn't have to look over their shoulders every other second in fear that someone would round the corner and spot them. There was still the slight tension that someone would somehow manage to sneak up on them, but other than that, the three felt relatively at peace walking around the many halls. Maybe they should have just went and found Izo so they could get the rest of that tour, but none of them wanted to go do that right now. This way the three were free to examine anything and everything without suspicion. Did Luffy just weirdly sniff that door? Yes, he did, because it smelled like food, which led the brothers to find out that someone was storing a secret stash of candy in there. Did they take just a bit? Maybe, but no one would know, because they were completely alone in the hall. Did Sabo just freeze in the hall and tilt his head up a bit, not moving for a few seconds? Yes, he did, because he could hear someone above deck mumbling to themselves about a ghost story they had heard that was messing with their heads, making them think the ship was haunted. Did the three laugh about this? Yes, they did, because they knew there were much scarier things than ghosts in this world. Did Ace just stand and watch a fly buzz throughout the hall for a minute before it turned the corner and disappeared? Yes, he did, because he swore that same fly had been in the mess hall the day before. He remembered the slightly messed up wing on it, most likely from getting swatted at. Did the brothers sit and wonder for a second how that fly had managed to get into the deepest part of the Moby? Yes, they did, because there was no one around to wonder what they were doing. The brothers decided that they liked the inside of the Moby, because they could get lost inside it, and not worry about anyone but themselves for a moment. Chapter 42. The Return of the Darkness. It had been a peaceful night for once. At least, that's what Ace and Sabo had thought. Upon waking up though, they found that it had not been a peaceful night, and it wouldn't be a peaceful morning. Luffy, wake up, you're just dreaming, Sabo said as he shook the youngest, hoping he would wake up. Come on Lu, open your eyes, Ace prodded, sitting up in bed and turning to face the youngest whose eyes were scrunched tightly. Neither Ace nor Sabo had noticed that Luffy had been having a nightmare, which was already odd, because normally he would make sounds that would wake Sabo up, but nothing like that had happened this time. The only reason they knew that their brother was having another nightmare was because his breathing was faster than normal, and his eyes were scrunched. Not to mention the sweat covering his forehead. Lu, it's alright, Ace and I are right here, Sabo soothed, hoping it would have some effect. There was no outward reaction to the blonde's words though, and, if anything, Luffy only got worse. He was stuck in a nightmare. How long do you think he's been like this? Ace asked, feeling bad that he hadn't noticed Luffy was having another nightmare. I don't know. I thought it was weird that he hadn't had any nightmares. Sabo said, also feeling bad about it. Ace and Sabo had only just gotten up and had noticed Luffy was in a nightmare only minutes after, but that didn't make them feel any better. It's just a bad dream, Luffy, just wake up and it'll be gone. Ace said softly, smoothing back the hair matting to the sweaty boy's forehead. After a few more minutes of this, the two oldest were beginning to worry. Have any of us been stuck in a nightmare for this long before? Ace asked with worry in his voice. Sabo spared him a glance, and Ace could see the worry on the blonde's face as clear as he could hear it in his own voice. I don't know. I don't think so. Sabo said, and at this point, Luffy was beginning to make noise, but it wasn't anything good. He sounded terrified, whimpers and sounds of pain escaping that made Ace and Sabo's hearts start to beat a bit faster. Luffy, calm down. Sabo tried, holding the raven's shoulder. Luffy's breathing was picking up now, and Sabo could hear the pounding of the smallest heart. It unnerved the brothers and only doubled their attempts at trying to wake him up. Luffy. Come on, Lu, it's just a nightmare. Ace hissed for the umpteenth time, beginning to lightly shake the boy again. Luffy's breathing only got heavier and his heart beat faster. Maybe something's wrong. What if the doctors gave him something that didn't take effect for a while? Sabo asked, far past worry and quickly moving into panic. Ace didn't know how to respond, because honestly, he was thinking along those same lines himself. But, Luffy. Ace had been cut off when Luffy suddenly sprung up in bed. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated and his hair stuck to his face from the sweat covering it. He was panting heavily, and his heartbeat was still pounding in his chest almost painfully as adrenaline pumped through his veins. He was rigid for a few seconds, and Ace and Sabo were afraid to touch him in fear that they would set him off, but after a few seconds, he slacked a bit, breathing evening out slightly and heartbeat slowing. You alright, Luffy? Sabo asked gently, not wanting to scare the youngest any more than he already was. Luffy didn't respond, instead looking around for something until Ace placed a straw hat in his lap. Apparently, this had been what Luffy had been looking for because he stopped scanning the room and instead grabbed the hat tightly in his grip for a minute before pulling it down on his head. Luffy? Ace asked quietly, this time Luffy looking over at him. You want to talk about it? Ace asked, not knowing what to expect from his brother. Silence followed the suggestion, and after a few seconds that felt like hours, Luffy answered. It was really bright, he started, slightly confusing Ace and Sabo. Bright? Sabo asked, and Luffy nodded, continuing. It was really bright, and then it started getting foggy, and the fog was black, and it made it hard to breathe and see, Luffy explained, shivering at the memory of the nightmare. And then it was all black and I couldn't breathe anymore, and it was really loud and it hurt. Luffy finished, gripping the edges of his hat. At least it was just a nightmare, Sabo said, rubbing Luffy's back. Why don't we go see Whiskey about your bandages, and then go take a bath? Luffy, you could probably go sit with Whitebeard, while Ace and I go to the nurse. Sabo suggested, thinking that the infirmary was not a place Luffy needed to be at right now, trusting the captain to keep Luffy safe. A few minutes they would be in there. Sabo. Luffy agreed, cutting off Ace's retort. Even though Sabo and Luffy had told him about how they were supposedly trusting Whitebeard and Marco, now that didn't mean he liked leaving Luffy anywhere that wasn't with him. It'll be fine, Ace, don't worry, we'll only be a few minutes, and I'll be able to hear him, Sabo said, trying to get Ace to see reason and show him that Luffy wouldn't be able to handle the infirmary right now. Despite looking like he didn't like the plan, Ace nodded, deciding to go along with it for now. But he would be grilling Sabo every second to make sure that nothing was happening to Luffy. They were all still trying to get comfortable on this pirate ship, and the only way they could do that was by going out of their comfort zone, while also making sure that they stayed safe as they did. If they had no means of making sure Luffy was okay the entire time, then they would have never even considered letting him stay out on deck alone, no matter how much they trusted the pirates in this moment. Luffy was still a bit jittery and on edge, which was normal, considering he had been stuck in a nightmare only minutes before. It was always bad to wake up from one of those, they felt so real and were extremely disorienting. Because of this, the brothers decided to wait a couple minutes before they left the room to make sure Luffy would be okay before being bombarded with noises and people. It was almost time for breakfast, but that would have to wait until after the infirmary visit. When they deemed themselves ready to leave the room, they all shuffled out of bed, Luffy gripping his brother's hands tightly in his own, as he followed them out the door and out onto the deck. It was as lively as always, but the brothers were able to easily maneuver their way around the crowd, careful not to let anyone get too close to them. If you want to leave for whatever reason you can, just come find Ace and I, alright? Sabo tapped out on Luffy's hand, the boy nodding as he glanced at everyone around them. And if anyone tries anything, scream so Sabo and I can know. Ace added, tapping his own sentence on Luffy's other hand. Luffy nodded again, feeling the tension coming from his brothers at the thought that they would be leaving him with the captain out on deck without them. We won't be long. Hopefully, we'll be done before you know it. Sabo tapped as they reached the captain. Marco was a little bit away. Ace could see him talking to some people, and only Atmos and Rakio were near the captain, which made the brothers calm a bit that not all the commanders were there. See you soon, Lou. Ace snapped as he and Sabo reluctantly let go of Luffy's hands, allowing the boy to walk freely over to the captain, while Ace and Sabo continued walking over towards the infirmary. The two oldest began to have a mindless conversation between each other, to keep themselves looking calm, while they focused all their attention onto Luffy. Luffy walked quietly up to the captain, who was now noticing his presence. Looking up at the giant, he tilted his head, taking in the man's emotions, and finding that none of them were bad. "Now, can you tell me a story?" Luffy asked, trying to keep the timidness from his voice as he did. He did like the captain, especially his warm feelings, but the nightmare was still fresh in his mind, keeping him on edge perpetually whether he wanted to be or not. Of course, which one shall I tell today? Whitebeard asked, more to himself. Luffy could feel the man's curiosity and confusion, but otherwise, he could feel the happiness and warmth coming from the captain, outweighing the other two emotions. The quick check showed that there was still no signs of graying in the captain's ore, so Luffy decided everything was good for now and sat down on the ground, preparing himself to listen to his story. Seeing that their brother was safe for now, Ace and Sabo felt a bit of their tension leave as they opened the door to the hall leading to the infirmary. Sabo made sure to keep himself tuned in on Whitebeard's story and anything and everything that was happening within a 20-foot radius of Luffy. The two continued on to the infirmary at a slightly faster pace, ignoring the questioning looks sent their way when the pirates around them realized Luffy wasn't with them. It wasn't too much longer a walk, and within minutes they were at the door, Ace grabbing the handle and opening the door. The infirmary was void of any patients, and there were nurses milling around the room doing their own thing. Whiskey, who was looking at some files, looked up at their entrance and smiled to them. "Ah, Ace, Sabo, glad that you two actually came. I thought you would try and avoid this place," Whiskey said in a friendly tone as she walked up to them. It felt weird not to have Luffy with them to tell them if the nurse was being genuinely happy, or if she was trying to deceive them. Either way, though, Sabo put on a smile. "We tend to keep our promises," Sabo said, and that was the truth. When Ace and Sabo had met Luffy, they slowly realized how much promises meant to the small boy, and made a habit of not making promises they couldn't keep. Ever since then they've also held those who keep their promises in high regard, because most people were quick to abandon their promises when it was most convenient for them. "Well, that's good. Why don't we get started? I'm sure you two want to be on your way," Whiskey said, gesturing to a chair that Ace could sit in while grabbing her wheelie stool. "How's Luffy?" Ace asked as they waited for Whiskey to make her way back to them. "Good, Whitebeard's telling him his story, and for the most part, people aren't getting too close. Marco's gotten a bit closer to him since we left though," Sabo said, not knowing if that made him feel better or worse. He did trust Marco about as much as he trusted Whitebeard, so in that respect he felt a bit better, but at the same time, what if his trust was misplaced and Marco turned on them? "Alright, let's get those bandages off. Have you felt any pain? Soreness?" Whiskey's voice brought the two back to what was happening, and Ace had to clear his throat, not having expected the questionnaire. "No, feel fine," Ace said a bit gruffly, though Sabo expected it. "That's good to hear," Whiskey said as she began removing the bandages that covered Ace's torso. Once they were all off, Ace saw that the once harsh and violent wound that spanned Ace's chest was now a mere pink line, almost completely gone now. "It seems to be healing nicely. I don't think you'll need another set of bandages, so I'll let you go, but just remember, don't do any heavy lifting. We don't want to reverse any of the progress," Whiskey said, sitting straight after leaning over to examine the wound. "Thank you, Whiskey. I'll make sure he follows those instructions," Sabo said as he stood, suddenly ready to leave. Ace noticed this and felt himself tense up a bit. Was something happening to Luffy? Ace was watching Sabo's face and hands, ready to see if he'd say anything, and just when he was about to ask himself, Sabo glanced over to him, worry pulling in his eyes despite the smile he wore. This made Ace stand as well, just as ready to leave as Sabo was. "Then you two are free to go," Whiskey said with a smile and wave as she began heading further into the infirmary once more. Sabo nodded to her and waved back, turning and practically rushing out the room, Ace following close behind. "What's going on?" Ace hissed to Sabo, ready to go beat some pirates up if they were hurting Luffy. "Luffy's heading this way, and by the sounds of it he's terrified," Sabo said, frowning now. Ace did the same, feeling the anger begin to fill him. He didn't know why Luffy was terrified, but whatever caused it, he would stop it. Ace and Sabo hadn't been gone all that long, maybe only a couple of minutes. Luffy was sitting, actually enjoying a story that Whitebeard was telling him about one of his many adventures. He had noticed that Marco had gotten a bit closer, but he wasn't hurting him, so Luffy allowed it. None of the pirates were getting too close to him, and he was thankful for that. He was still a bit on edge, though Whitebeard's story was calming him down a lot more now. Time was passing quicker than Luffy thought it would, and soon he was completely immersed in this story, nightmare forgotten. He was beginning to enjoy himself, getting lost in the words the captain used. Of course, something had to ruin that. It was like someone dumped a bucket of cold water on him. 1 second he was fine, happy, not a care in the world, and then, like a switch, he could feel the terror running through his veins, an icky feeling in the air that he didn't like at all. He could feel darkness. His heart rate suddenly sped up from its calm, slow pace to that of a racehorse. He glanced around, trying to figure out where the slimy gross feeling was coming from, noticing that it wasn't actually on the ship, but heading their way. Forgetting the story completely now, Luffy stood, beelining it to the infirmary. He had to get Sabo and Ace. He had to tell them that someone with the darkness was coming. They would know what to do, they were strong and smart, and they would help him. He walked quickly, ignoring the looks he got from his sudden exit, and the no doubt look of terror showing on his face. As much as he wanted to run, he was already drawing attention, and he didn't want to draw anymore, so he opted for a very brisk walk. When he reached the hallway leading to the infirmary, he saw the door open, his brothers coming out, worry on their faces, and Luffy could feel the worry, anger and a bit of panic coming from them. "Luffy, what's wrong? Did someone do something? Are you okay? I knew we shouldn't have left you out there alone." Ace's fast speaking did nothing to calm Luffy, but even so, he was near his brothers now, and that by itself helped him calm down a bit. "Hold on, Ace, don't go frying them yet." "What happened, Luffy?" Sabo asked, grabbing the back of Ace's shirt, before the eldest could go charging out on deck and swinging his fists. Trying to slow his heavy breathing, Luffy focused on the warmth he could feel in his brothers, a harsh contrast to the icky darkness that was growing ever closer. "Darkness. Darkness is coming," Luffy said, a bit out of breath. His words made Ace and Sabo freeze, all of Ace's anger draining and morphing into worry and fear. "It's coming. So it's not on the boat?" Sabo asked after a second of trying to gather his thoughts. Luffy shook his head. "No, but it's getting closer," Luffy said quietly, feeling the darkness grow stronger and stronger. It made him shiver. "We should leave then. I don't know who's got this darkness or what they want, but I don't want anything to do with them," Ace said firmly, trying to keep himself from bolting to the first lifeboat he could find. "Hold on, let's not go doing anything crazy yet," Sabo said, trying to remain level-headed despite the fear he felt. He could hear people talking, most wondering what had Luffy so scared, the pirates having noticed the look of terror on the boy's face. "Let's go to a room, we'll talk there," Sabo said, already beginning to walk hastily back in the direction of their room. "Fine, but if someone tries stopping us, I'm not promising that I won't punch them," Ace growled, feeling jittery and on edge with the news that someone with darkness was coming. Luffy grabbed his brother's hands tightly in his, and the two oldest squeezed his hands, both for his comfort and theirs. Once again they went out on deck, ignoring the looks they got, something they were good at, and went straight to their room. Once inside, Sabo shut the door, listening for a second to make sure no one followed them or was trying to listen in on them. "Alright, now, how close are they?" Sabo asked Luffy, noticing the boy was beginning to sweat and was fidgeting restlessly. "Really close, about to be here in a few minutes," Luffy said, trying more and more to take in the warmth from his brothers, but the darkness was growing stronger and stronger. It wasn't even here yet, and it was almost as strong as Harry's had been. That thought did nothing to help Luffy's growing anxiety. "Then what are we doing waiting around here for it to come? Let's leave," Ace nearly shouted, Sabo shushing him before he alerted the whole ship. "Now hold on, Ace. We don't know if they'll actually come here. For all we know, it's a passing group of pirates and they don't even want to stop here." Sabo tried to reason, though maybe it was more for himself. "And what if it's not? What if it's doctors and these pirates ratted us out, huh? What if they told the Marines and they sent someone here to get us and take us back?" Ace asked, clenching his fists tightly at his side. "If that's the case, then we will fight. I wouldn't stop you from burning this ship and the other ship to the bottom of the sea, but right now we don't know if that's the case. Let's just wait. If they come aboard, I'll listen and find out if it's Marines or doctors, and if it is, we leave, no objections," Sabo said, trying to stop the jitters he felt from the adrenaline. "There's still the chance that it's opposing pirates though, and that they just have a really bad person on their crew. They could be passing merchants, bounty hunters, or maybe even travelers, but we can't go running from something that might not even be a threat to us," Sabo continued. "What if they're a part of this crew then? What if it's one of these pirates?" Ace asked, and Sabo honestly hadn't thought about that, even though he knew it should have been one of his first thoughts. But they had never encountered the darkness outside of the facility, and it hadn't come to mind that it could be a part of this crew that they were just starting to grow comfortable around. "If it is, then we'll leave. If that's the case though, we'll need to figure out how we're getting off this ship. We know where the lifeboats are, but where are we gonna go? We don't have any way of navigating these waters," Sabo said, more to himself as he tried thinking quickly, knowing they were on a time limit. "We have Shanks' paper," Luffy suddenly said, pulling said paper from the ribbon in his hat. Ace and Sabo looked over at the boy in shock that he had thought of that. "I completely forgot about that," Ace said in shock, pulling his own piece from his pocket. Sabo nodded, having forgotten about it as well, pulling it from his own pocket. Maybe we can ask to use a snail phone then, and let Shanks know we're coming. That way we can actually catch up to them if we do go after them, Sabo said, flipping the paper over and seeing the number written on the back of it. After they all agreed to the plan, they sat in tense silence, waiting to see who had the darkness and what their intentions were. They're here. Chapter 43. Darkness revealed. They're here, Luffy whispered softly from where he sat on the bed, bringing his knees to his chest and holding them. Sabo frowned and nodded, sitting against the door and concentrating on listening to everyone out on the deck, keeping an ear out for anyone coming near the ship. Ace was sitting on the bed with Luffy, sitting on the edge of it, tapping his foot on the ground anxiously as he watched Sabo closely, waiting for any kind of reaction. Boy, Teach's group is back. Someone grabbed the ladder. Hear the pops, his mission must have gone alright then. Sabo could hear all the talking, the rope ladder going down, the group of pirates boarding, the celebrating. Everything. Luffy, are they on the ship? Sabo asked quietly, really hoping that this wasn't the person with the darkness. If it was, that meant that someone a part of the Whitebeards had the darkness, and if that was the case that meant that they would have to leave. After they were just getting used to this place too. MHMM. Luffy hummed, shaking a bit now as the dark feeling crept over him. Who is it, Sabo? Ace asked, frown on his face as his foot tapped faster. It's someone a part of the Whitebeards. The group of them just got back from some mission. Sabo said, standing away from the door now as he told his brothers. That's it then. We're leaving, we can't stay here. Ace said in a slight growl, fists clenched at his sides. Sabo nodded, taking a deep breath. You're right. Alright, we have to get to the snail phones. Sabo said, trying to think quickly in case this person somehow knew about them and was here to hurt them. He listened to what was happening outside for a second and frowned. What if we go ask Marco to use the phones, that way no one gets suspicious and we can get out of here, Sabo suggested, trying to figure out the safest route out of here. Ace frowned, not liking the idea of talking to anyone on this ship now, but knew that Sabo was normally good at planning these things out. Nodding along to the plan, he stood up, Luffy also getting up, though a bit shakier. Okay, then we'll go out, I'll ask Marco, and if for some reason he doesn't let us then we'll sneak down there anyway and call Shanks, Sabo said, going over the plan quickly. Luffy quickly sidled up in between Ace and Sabo, grabbing their hands as they left the room, trying to take calming breaths. The closer they got to the deck though, the more suffocating the darkness got, reminding him of his nightmare earlier that morning. When they reached the deck they all scanned it quickly, Ace spotting the first commander quickly, and leading them to him, while Sabo listened around for anyone talking about them, while also keeping an ear out on those who had just come to the ship, knowing one of them had the darkness. Luffy, which one has the darkness? Sabo asked as he looked over the crew. Luffy also began scanning for a second before potentially spotting whoever it was harboring the dark feeling, shrinking back a bit. That guy, the one with the long black curly hair, missing teeth, black bandana. Luffy tapped as he swallowed thickly, another shiver running through him as he put a face with the feeling. Ace and Sabo zeroed in on the man quickly, both frowning and tightening their hold on Luffy's hands. From what they could see, he looked like a pretty normal, friendly guy, but knowing that he had the darkness in him made it all that much worse. Moving their attention away from the man they turned to where they were closing in on Marco, Sabo preparing himself to act as if nothing was wrong at the moment. Marco? Sabo called as they grew closer, placing a smile on his face, though it was a bit tense despite his best efforts. Yes, Yuri. Marco asked as he turned to face them, not having noticed that they were even back out on deck. Sorry to bother you, but we were wondering if we could use one of your snail phones. Luffy wanted to talk to Shanks. If that's okay with you, that is. Sabo said, doing his best to not raise any flags with the commander. Sure, I'll take you there, Yuri, Marco said, making Sabo nearly sigh in relief as they followed the first mate into the ship, towards where they knew the snail phones were. Even so, the three of them were still on guard, having no idea what could happen next, seeing as there was someone with the darkness on board. The group walked silently through the halls until they finally reached the room, Marco stopping and pushing the door open. Do you want me to stay here until you're done? Marco asked, Sabo shaking his head because that was exactly what they didn't want him to do. No thank you, that's fine. Thank you, Commander. Sabo said with another smile as he watched the man nod and turn to leave. The brothers didn't dare move until they saw him turn the corner and disappear, leaving the three alone. Finally, let's get off this damn ship. Ace hissed as he nearly bolted into the room, Luffy following. Sabo sighed, also following, pulling the door shut behind him. He was barely 2 steps into the room, and Ace had already pulled one of the snail phones close, and was putting in Shanks' number, a look of concentration on his face. Ace was sitting in the chair at the end of the table, Luffy in his lap as he watched his brother put in the number. Sabo joined the two, sitting in the chair beside them. P-U-R-U. The three waited in tense silence for the red-haired captain to pick up. P-U-R-U. More silence as they waited, not knowing what to do if he didn't pick up. Pure purgacha. A collective sigh of relief resounded from the brothers at the sound of the snail being picked up. Akagami here, what was this? Luffy's face lit up while Sabo took the snail from Ace before he could begin ranting. Shanks, it's us, Sabo said, watching the snail's face light up in recognition. Ah, Anchor and his brothers. Everything going alright? Shanks asked, an inquisitive look now appearing on the snail's face. Actually no, Sabo said a bit hesitantly, glancing to the door as he made sure no one was listening in on them. Oh? How so? What's happened? Shanks asked, the snail frowning. Sabo frowned as well, turning his attention back to the snail. Well, you remember how we told you Luffy could sense people's feelings? Sabo started, hesitant to even be saying this much out loud. Yes, Shanks said, waiting for him to elaborate. And do you remember how we told you about the darkness? Sabo said, voice going lower at the mention of the feeling. Shanks' frown deepened as well, sensing the seriousness. Yes, I do. The doctors had it, correct? Shanks asked as he remembered what the brothers had told them. Sabo nodded. Yes, and you remember how we told you that people with that feeling were bad? Very bad. Sabo asked, and again Shanks' snail nodded in response. Yes. I assume you're telling me all of this again for a reason. Shanks said, already having a feeling as to where this conversation was going, but still unsure. I am. The thing is, someone here has the darkness. Sabo said, wondering how Shanks would react. Luffy shifted, the feeling of the darkness still creeping over to him, even when the man was still out on the deck. That's actually pretty surprising. Do you know who it is? Shanks asked, sounding legitimately surprised by the information. Sabo thought back to what people had been saying, specifically to the person Luffy had pointed out. Yeah, I'm pretty sure someone called him Teach, Sabo said after a second. Shanks' look of surprise quickly morphed into one of understanding, turning to a frown quickly after. Ah, now it all makes sense. I always knew that man was no good, Shanks said with a hint of anger in his tone. We were wondering if we could come to you. After what happened in the facility, we'd really rather not be near anyone with the darkness at the moment. Sabo said, hoping the captain would agree to at least wait for them. Have you told Whitebeard about the darkness? Shanks asked, confusing the brothers. No, we haven't even told them anything about what happened in the facility, much less the fact that Luffy can sense feelings, Sabo explained. I think you should tell them. Not about the facility and all of that, but at least warn them about Teach. I highly doubt that they even have a clue that he could be up to no good. Whitebeard and his crew are good people. Teach is just an unfortunate outlier that could end up causing them harm in the future, if they don't have any clue about him. Shanks explained, and though Sabo knew why Shanks wanted them to do this, it was still a lot to ask. No way in hell. We're leaving the second we're done with this conversation. We're not staying another second near that bastard. Ace growled out, gripping the arms on his chair tightly. Sabo sighed, but couldn't find it in himself to disagree with Ace. I understand, and you don't need to tell them about the whole Luffy can sense feelings thing, just tell them to look out for him. Tell them that he's someone they should keep an eye out for. I still think the Whitebeards are good people and that you should stay with them, but if you disagree and decide you still want to leave after you tell them, then I'll wait for you to come to my ship. I'll leave and turn around and start heading back toward you. Shanks said, leaving the brothers to sit in silence for a second. So you're saying that all we have to do is warn them about Teach, and then we can leave? Sabo asked, the snail nodding in affirmation. Yes, but again, I still think you should stay. Trust me, they're good people. Well, besides Teach, that is, stay away from him, but other than that, they'll keep you safe. Probably better than I can. Shanks said. Another moment of silence passed over them as they took in Shanks' words until, eventually, Sabo spoke up again. Alright, we'll warn them, but we make no promises on staying here afterward. The blonde said a bit reluctantly. That's all I ask. I'll call back in a few minutes so you can tell me what you're going to do. Shanks replied with a bit of a sigh. Sabo nodded. Thank you, Shanks. He said, getting ready to hang up. No problem, Sabo. Gotcha. The sound of the snail going to sleep sounded, Sabo placing the receiver back in its place and leaning back in his chair. Well, I guess we should go tell Marco about Teach then, Sabo said with a sigh, running his fingers through his hair. But we could just nod and pretend we did, Ace muttered, earning a glare from both Sabo and Luffy. Just a suggestion. I don't want any of us getting near that guy again. Ace said, raising his hands up defensively. But we told Shanks we would tell Marco, so we gotta tell Marco, Luffy said determinedly, even though he himself definitely didn't want to go back out on deck where Teach was either. Luffy's right, if Shanks is right, I would rather warn them about Teach, so they can avoid any issue with him in the future, Sabo said, moving to stand. Ace pouted a bit but nodded, Luffy getting off his lap as the two stood as well, following Sabo to the door. Teach is still out on the deck with Marco, but they're not that close. If we're lucky we won't have to even look at Teach. Sabo said as he took note of where people were on deck, noticing someone talking to Teach where he knew the railings were while also hearing Marco giving out commands from the upper deck. Let's make this quick then. Ace tapped as they began to walk briskly through the halls, Sabo having closed the door behind them. Once they were reaching the door that would open up to the deck, they slowed, Sabo listening quickly before pushing it open, leading his brothers away from Teach and to where he heard Marco. Ace was keeping a close eye on Teach, eyes narrowed on the man as they walked, and Luffy sidled up closer to Sabo, who was in the front, the brothers walking in a straight line with Ace at the back. Marco. Sabo called cheerfully, as if it was a coincidence that the brothers were once again stumbling upon the man. The first mate turned to look at the approaching brothers, raising an eyebrow. Confused, curious. Luffy tapped, so his brothers could know what they were walking into when it came to how people were perceiving them. He knew that, with the appearance of the darkness, everything and everyone was now much more suspicious than they had been the day before. Welcome back. How was your talk with Akagami, Yuri? Marco asked, giving the brothers his attention. The smile remained on Sabo's face, while Ace continued to keep watch on Teach from the corner of his eye. Luffy was carefully taking note of the emotions he could feel coming from the first mate, reporting them all to Sabo. It went well, thank you. It's a bit busy up here today, Sabo said, trying to subtly get Marco to bring up Teach first, so it wouldn't be all that weird for him to just suddenly mention them. Marco nodded, taking a glance at the pirates that were still unloading things from the ship Teach had come from. That's right, the group that was sent out to handle a mission came back recently, Yui, Marco explained, and Luffy could still sense the slight confusion coming from the man, though other than that he felt calm and generally at peace. Were they successful? Sabo asked as if he was oblivious, though he had already heard all the conversations about how successful they had been. Marco nodded though, completely unaware that Sabo held this knowledge. They were, Yuri. Teach has been bragging about since he got back. Marco said with a bit of an eye roll, though he wore a smirk at the mention. Sabo, silently pleased that Marco had mentioned Teach, pretended to look confused. Teach? He asked, using his best. Who's that? Look. You haven't met him, he was on the mission when you got here, Yuri. That's him right over there. Marco said, pointing the man out for them, though they all knew exactly who and where he was. So he's a part of the crew? Sabo asked a bit distantly as he observed the man a bit closer now that he had the opportunity. The ease that the man smiled and laughed with others, how friendly his outward appearance seemed, it was all still very unnerving to the brothers. He is, Yui, Marco said, also watching the man now. Sabo, knowing this was the time he needed to bring up the warning, swallowed thickly, preparing himself to get the words out. He had no idea how the pirate would react, and his nerves were beginning to jump. Nah, Marco. Sabo started carefully. Catching the sudden tone of seriousness coming from Sabo, Marco turned his attention back to the blonde brother, curiosity peaking now. You should keep an eye on him, Sabo said in a low, serious tone, quiet enough that only the first commander could hear him, as well as his brothers. Marco raised an eyebrow at that. What do you mean, Yuri? The commander asked. Sabo couldn't sense any hostility in the man's voice, and the confirmation from Luffy gave him the confidence to continue. Something bad will happen. Sabo continued, his mouth a bit dry as he spoke. To Teach? The first mate asked, not understanding what Sabo was trying to tell him. The blonde shook his head, face turning grim. No, not to him. Because of him, something bad will happen. Sabo elaborated. There was a beat of silence as Marco took in those words, glancing back at Teach for a second. And how is it that you know this, Yuri? Marco asked, and again Sabo waited for confirmation that there was no hostility coming from Marco before continuing. Ace, Sabo, Luffy. Akagami called back, said he forgot to tell Luffy something. Harita's voice called from the lower deck. Sabo turned to the pirate, smiling and nodding as he said they would be down in a minute. Turning back to Marco, his face turned serious again. Trust us on this, Commander, Sabo said, staying for a second more before he and his brothers left to go answer Shanks' call and give him their verdict. Sabo, Yuri. Marco's call made the brothers falter, Sabo turning to see what Marco wanted, hoping it wasn't to yell at him. I'll make sure to keep an eye out, Yuri, Marco said, his face just as serious as Sabo's had been moments earlier. Not knowing how to respond and wanting to leave, Sabo merely nodded in response, the three of them turning once more and making their way back to the Den mushroom. He could feel Marco watching them as they walked away, but he ignored it, dead set on the next few minutes. Depending on what they said and did, they could be off this ship and on the way to Shanks with either little to no problem or with a big fight. We're leaving now, right? Ace asked with an antsy look on his face, glancing this way and that as they shuffled their way through the pirates. Hopefully, yes. Sabo replied, listening for anyone following them, his heart rate picking up at the thought of getting caught. Luffy was snug in between the two oldest, eyes low as he tried blocking out the darkness wanting to creep in, but it wasn't easy. A quick brisk walk allowed them to reach the room with ease, Sabo closing the door and moving to pick up the receiver, the snail patiently waiting. Shanks? Sabo asked, holding the piece up to his mouth, listening anxiously to everything happening out on deck, nervous that someone would head their way and overhear their conversation. Sabo, did you tell them? Shanks asked, his voice loud and clear in the silence of the room. Sabo nodded, glancing to the door briefly. We did. he said shortly, wanting to leave as soon as possible. And? Shanks prodded, wanting to know how things went. We told Marco to watch out for Teach, and he said he would. Did he mean it, Lou? Sabo asked, knowing Luffy had been getting rid of Marco's feelings throughout the entire conversation. Luffy nodded, swinging his feet from where he sat on the table next to the snail. He meant it. He was worried and a little uneasy, but he meant it when he said he would keep an eye on him. Luffy relayed, remembering the feelings easily and the conviction the commander felt as he spoke to the brothers. Good. So, what's your verdict? Shanks asked, Sabo sighing a bit. We have to leave. We can't stay near someone with darkness, no matter how nice everyone else is. Sabo said a bit reluctantly. He had been getting comfortable here, Ace and Luffy too, and for them to suddenly have to leave was a bit disheartening, but there was no way that they would be comfortable staying on this ship in such close proximity to someone with that much darkness in them. I understand, but you need to know that it would be much harder for me to keep you safe. I don't have as much power as Whitebeard does, and the Marines may be a bit more hesitant toward me than other pirates, but that won't stop them from trying if they find out you're with me. Whitebeard would be able to keep you much safer. Shanks said, trying to make sure they understood exactly what it was they were giving up. You may get away from the darkness, but you would be giving up safety that no one else could provide. Shanks continued, the brothers listening in silence. No matter how safe someone is, the darkness trumps that. Ace said in a low voice, a scowl on his face. Whitebeard may be the safest place for now, but what happens if Teach goes around and starts turning people's blue into black, just like at the facility? This place would become much more dangerous than the facility had been. Sabo added, knowing it was a strong possibility that Teach could start planting dark thoughts into these pirates' heads, turning their blue into gray, and then black. If that were the case, I'd agree with you, but as it is now, Teach has been with the Whitebeards for at least a decade. If his goal was to turn everyone on the ship into those with the darkness, wouldn't there be more people there with it by now? Shanks countered. Sabo had to agree, it was a bit weird that the man had, supposedly, been there that long and not a single other pirate that they had seen had the darkness. If he had been there this long, it should be crawling with people with the darkness. That's not the point is, we can't stay here with him because any second he could find out about our numbers and go tell the Marines about us. People with the darkness couldn't give two craps about what happens to others, only what would benefit themselves. Ace hissed out, annoyed that this was even a conversation they were having. They should have been off this boat by now, watching it get smaller as they sailed away from it. I know, you're right, Ace, I just worry I won't be able to keep you as safe as Whitebeard could, that's all. It's not gonna be easy to keep the Marines off both my and your backs. Shanks said again, knowing how stressed the brothers must be. Sabo took a deep breath, closing his eyes and rubbing his hand over his face. I'm sorry we're asking so much of you, Shanks. It will be more difficult for you if you have to worry about us on your ship, especially with all the Marines out searching for us. But even if we wanted to stay, someone with the darkness is much more of a danger to us than the Marines. I don't think there's much that you, or anyone, could do to get us to want to stay. Sabo explained, knowing they were putting Shanks into a difficult position. You're right, Sabo, it is a bit of a tight spot you three are putting me in, and even so, I'm more than happy to help any way I can, but again, I'm just letting you know what you're giving up, what you're going to lose when you come here. Safety isn't something that you can get easily, not when the entire government is working their butts off to find you, and when you step off the Whitebeard ship, you're going to lose the safety that you three desperately need. Shanks once again reiterated, trying to drill into the boys just what they were giving up. There was silence now as they thought this over. Safety was something that they needed, Shanks was right about that, but was it still that much safer here on the Whitebeard ship, when there was someone with the darkness on board? Sure, if they had been here this long and hadn't hurt anyone, surely that was a good sign, but that didn't by any means mean that they were a good person. In fact, it was the complete opposite, it just meant that whatever they were planning to do was taking a long time to put into motion. So would they be giving up all that much to go join Shanks on his ship? Did the safety that came with being on the Whitebeard pirate's ship outweigh the danger of being near someone with the darkness? I don't want Marco and Mr. Captain to get hurt, Luffy spoke softly, reluctantly. His head was down and his feet, which had been swinging, weren't moving. He was gripping his pants in his fists, and Ace and Sabo could see the frown on his face. What do you mean, Lou? Sabo asked, confused. If we leave, then Teach is gonna hurt him. I don't want him to get hurt, they're good people, but I don't want to stay around the darkness either. Luffy explained, feeling conflicted. Ace and Sabo watched the boy, neither one of them knowing what to say in response. They didn't want Marco or Whitebeard to get hurt either, after all, they had been the ones to save them from the facility, and keep them safe from Marines ever since, but, like Luffy, they didn't want to stay anywhere near the darkness. There's nothing we can do though, not unless we stay. Ace said, and by the sound of his voice, he most definitely did not want to stay. Even if we do stay, what can we do? We'd just be tiptoeing around Teach trying to avoid him. Sabo added, even though he did want to help the Whitebeards. Luffy's frown deepened. I know, but we could make sure he doesn't hurt him, Luffy mumbled softly, his feet swinging slightly now as he spoke. It seems we're all very divided on what you should do. Shanks piped in with a sigh. He was right though, because as much as the brothers wanted to leave, there was a part of them that longed to stay, not only to keep the pirates safe, but because this was the first place they had felt normal since the facility, the first place that they were able to get comfortable at. It is weird though. If Teach has been here for as long as you say, what's his goal? Everyone with the darkness is motivated by something, most of the time it's nothing good, so what's Teach's plan? Sabo pondered more to himself than to anyone else. I don't have any idea, but I do think that he's been hiding his true nature from Whitebeard, so to hear that it was him with the darkness wasn't that surprising, Shanks said, the snail now putting on a face as if it were in thought. Then that would mean he doesn't want the pirates to know about it. He's putting up an act to keep them from finding out about him, and most likely about his plan too. Sabo deduced, though that didn't answer much at all. That's great and all, but why are we talking about that bastard again? Ace asked, arms crossed over his chest impatiently. I'm just a bit confused is all Ace. After all, this is the first person outside of the facility that we've felt the darkness from. Sabo said with a bit of a shrug. Yeah, and that's exactly why we've got to get as much distance between us and him as fast as possible. Ace said with a bit of anger in his voice now. What if you leave and end up regretting it? Shanks' words made the brothers freeze, none of them having expected that question. What? Ace asked, not sure if he heard right. What if you leave and realize later that being on the Whitebeard's ship really was the best place for you and end up regretting it? Shanks elaborated, the brothers pondering his words for a minute. I really do think that you three should stay there for now. With Teach being there now, the Whitebeards don't know what he's capable of. Marco may be keeping an eye on him now, but he doesn't know what he's looking for, but you three do. If you keep an eye on him you can find out what he's up to, and at the same time keep him from hurting anyone. Shanks suggested, leaving the three in shock. You want us to spy on him? Ace hissed, already not liking the plan. You don't have to, but whenever he's around, keep an eye on him, make sure he's not trying to hurt anyone or plant any bad ideas in their heads. Otherwise, you could avoid him and continue to sail under Whitebeard's name safely. The red-haired captain explained, knowing that this would be a hard request to ask them. He truly wanted to help the brothers, and he truly believed that they would be better off on the Whitebeard's ship rather than his. No? No way. Ace said firmly, Sabo hesitating. The blonde knew why Shanks was asking them to do this. He understood that it would be more beneficial for them to stay on this ship, but the thought of being near the darkness deterred him from wanting to stay. Ace? No, Sabo, you're not going to try and talk me out of this like always. There's someone with darkness here, and that means we're leaving. These pirates are strong, and if Teach ends up trying anything I'm sure they'll be able to handle it. Ace growled out, his anger only rising with every second they stayed arguing about this. But what if they can't? You know as well as I do how dangerous someone with darkness can be. They're deceptive, and these pirates won't know until it's too late that they should be worried about Teach. Sabo tried reasoning. What do you want to do about it? It's not like we can just go and beat him up. For some reason, I don't think that'll go over so well with the others. Ace said sarcastically. Luffy's eyes began flicking in between his brothers, watching the two as they continued to argue back and forth. Shanks had gone silent as well, letting the two work things out on their own, before he would butt in with his own comments. Of course not, but Shanks is right, we could just watch him from afar. We don't get close, we don't let him near us, but we make sure he isn't trying to hurt anyone here. I don't want to be here with him either, but I don't want anyone getting hurt because we knew about him and did nothing to stop him. Sabo said, already feeling guilty for something that could happen in the future should they leave Teach to his own devices. Sabo was being swayed again. This kept seeming to happen. Whenever they had the perfect opportunity, the perfect reason to leave, he was swayed right back into staying with the Whitebeard pirates. Sabo didn't know how he felt about that, but he knew it was getting on Ace's nerves. The eldest had every right to be annoyed with him though. He had said that he wouldn't put up a fight if the darkness was a part of the Whitebeards. He had said they could leave without any fuss, but here he was, fussing. Despite this, Sabo couldn't find it in him to just leave quietly, and a look at Luffy showed the youngest felt the same as him on the subject. Luffy was clearly conflicted on what he wanted to do in this situation, wanting to help the pirates, but not wanting to be near Teach either. But Shanks had made some good points. Points that he had to take into account now that they were so close to jumping ship. If they did go to Shanks, they would have to be more diligent about staying hidden, they would have to be more careful of their surroundings, they would have to be more guarded, and that wasn't something that Sabo really wanted to do. The selfish part of him wanted to stay here, purely because he would be able to relax just slightly more than he would if they went to Shanks. In that case, Sabo, we still have to be on the same ship as him. If we go to Shanks we don't have to worry about that at all. Ace hissed, trying to keep his voice down, in case anyone was close enough to hear him should he start yelling. Sabo frowned. Yes, but in return for not having to worry about Teach, we have to worry about the whole of the government looking for us. Sabo hissed back, hoping his brother would see reason in what he was trying to say. At this point, Sabo didn't know if he even wanted to stay, but from the way he was arguing with Ace, it sure seemed like he did. We have to worry about that anyway. Ace argued back. Yes, but here we don't have to watch over our shoulder every 5 seconds like we would if we went to Shanks. Sabo countered, Luffy's head moving back and forth like he was watching a tennis match. Both Luffy and Sabo knew that Ace was only trying to keep them safe, but sometimes he could become narrow-minded and ignore the facts, telling them that staying here would be much safer for them than going to Shanks. Look, we're just repeating ourselves now. I know you don't want to stay, and really, I don't think I want to stay all that much either, but you have to see that the safer option would be to stay here with the Whitebeards. Leaving would mean giving up all the safety that comes with the Marines being scared of him, and not to mention all the territory he has would keep people from thinking twice about us. It would be easier for us to hide if we stayed with him, but if we went to Shanks, we would have to give up some of our freedoms, like being able to wander freely at islands. Sabo explained softly, making sure that Ace knew just what was at stake. The room went silent again, everyone thinking over their options. Finally, it was Shanks who spoke up. Why don't we do a trial run? Shanks asked, confusing the brothers. A trial run? Ace asked, wondering where this was going. Yeah. Stay on the ship for another day or two, watch Teach, and if by the end of it it's too unbearable to be near him, then you can come to my ship instead. This way you'll also have time to think over if you really want to leave or not, and I'll feel better knowing you thought through all of your options, and at least gave staying with the Whitebeards a try. Shanks explained, the brothers finding no complaints. Sabo and Luffy both nodded, agreeing to the plan, and turned to Ace, wondering how he felt about the idea. Ace was quiet, looking to be in deep thought. Alright, we'll stay for another day, just so I can show you that staying is a bad idea. He finally said a bit reluctantly. Luffy smiled, glad that they might be able to keep Marco and Whitebeard safe after all, while Sabo smiled as well, happy that Ace didn't put up too much of a fight at this new plan. Well, in that case, thank you Shanks, we'll call back tomorrow, Sabo said, the snail smiling. No problem boys. Talk to you tomorrow then. Shanks said, the snail hanging up after and leaving the room in silence once again. Chapter 44. A day with Teach. When the next day finally rolled around, the brothers found themselves waiting anxiously in their room for breakfast to be ready. They didn't want to leave the safety of the small room just yet, not wanting to go face the man filled with so much darkness that it rivaled hairs. Luffy could feel the darkness from there, which just went to show how much of it Teach had seen as they were inside the Moby, whereas Teach was somewhere out on the deck. It felt as if the man was standing right next to him. They had told Shanks that they would give today a try, that they would do their best to be on the same ship with Teach, but none of them said that they would be actively going anywhere near the man. It felt just like it had their first week in their room, all of them barely even venturing out for food. Sabo could hear pirates beginning to file into the galley for breakfast, and he realized that, if they wanted to eat, they would have to head out now. They just had to get through this last day, then they could leave. There was still the part of him that wanted to stay, though. Come on, breakfast is done, Sabo said a bit curtly, not wanting to be near Teach, but knowing that it was inevitable. Despite his words, the three didn't move, all of them trying to encourage themselves to do it, but none of them actually doing it. After a minute of this, Ace finally sighed and stood up, scowling as he did so, and made his way to the door, practically flinging it open as he stalked down the hall toward the galley. Sabo and Luffy shared a glance but followed the eldest silently. The closer to the galley they got, the harder it was for Luffy to breathe. It was like a cloud of darkness was engulfing the galley, and stepping into it would be like submerging yourself in water. In the darkness, though, there was a lightness. Warmth. Whitebeard was in the galley too, and Luffy noticed that the strong wave of warmth that the giant emitted counterbalanced the darkness that Teach emitted. Pleased by this finding, Luffy allowed the warmth to engulf him, to drive away any feeling of darkness, and was pleasantly surprised when, after letting the warmth in, there wasn't a single hint of darkness, despite the fact that Teach was only sitting a few tables away. Ace and Sabo noticed their brother, who, moments ago, was tense, breathing heavy, and practically shaking, suddenly relaxed, a hint of a smile forming. This confused them, especially since Teach was within eyesight. Luffy? Ace tapped in question as the brothers went to the table to sit. I'm letting the warmth in to stop the darkness. Luffy answered, knowing what his brother was going to ask. Ace and Sabo frowned, but only because they were concerned. Not too much, Lou, don't overdo it. Sabo warned, Luffy nodding in understanding, feeling the worry coming from his brothers. He would be careful, he would only let in enough warmth to stop the darkness, no matter how good it felt, and how much he wanted to let it all in. The brothers sat down at the table with the commanders, trying their best to both ignore, yet keep an eye on, Teach. Luffy made sure to focus on the man's emotions, all of them except the darkness, to look for any sudden change or any malicious feelings that could harm him, his brothers, or the pirates. Ace was scanning the room, but more often than not he was looking toward the smiling pirate, anger rising inside him, at how naturally Teach could put on a friendly act, despite the dark intentions he knew the man had to have. Meanwhile, Sabo was keeping a close ear on Teach, while also listening and interacting with the commanders and captain. Thatch came out soon enough, the brothers' food along with the captain's in his hands, as he announced breakfast was being served. Pyrrhus began standing, shuffling over to where the food was being served, while Thatch began setting the plates he had down, Sabo thanking him as he did. The brothers ate quickly and silently, and by the time the commanders were just beginning eating, the brothers were finishing. Ace looked ready to start leaving, Luffy too, but Sabo had an idea. "Now Thatch, do you think you could get some seconds for Ace and Luffy?" Sabo asked in as polite a tone he could manage with Teach in the room, putting a pleasant smile on his face as he did. Ace halted from where he was mid-rise, sitting back down instantly and giving Sabo a confused look. Luffy, who was also confused, merely glanced at the blonde, more focused on the fact that he would be able to eat more. "Sabo, what are you doing?" Ace asked, tense. Hadn't one of their rules been to not ask for much, including more food, seeing as they already ate so much? Sabo ignored his brother, smile not leaving his face. Thatch seemed a bit shocked, but got over it quickly, a smile lighting up his own face as he nodded, standing. "Sure thing Sabo, I'll be right back with it," he said cheerfully, a hint of excitement in his voice as he rushed back towards the kitchen. The commanders had turned their attention to the brothers now, eyebrows raised, but Sabo ignored them, splitting his attention once more between Teach and the commanders and captain. "You two are still hungry? I think I'd be full for a year if I ate that much." This is said, and Luffy sensed no maliciousness in the comment, only good-heartedness. Telling Sabo as much, the blonde lifted his head to respond. "My brothers are quite well known for having black holes where their stomachs should be," Sabo said with a bit of a laugh, trying to keep an air of indifference and calm around himself. Before more could be said, Thatch returned, plates in hand, placing them in front of Ace and Luffy. "There you go," Thatch said happily as he placed plates in front of Ace and Luffy before returning to his seat. The two brothers hesitated a second, not quite knowing what was happening still, but after a quick look to each other, they shrugged and dug in. They weren't going to deny good food, especially when they were still hungry. The commanders only watched them for another second before their attention was drawn elsewhere, and they carried on with their own meals. Sabo waited for his brothers to be done while keeping a close ear on Teach, listening to him laugh and joke with other members of the crew. When they were finished, they left the galley as fast as they usually did, but this time they stopped outside the galley doors. "Should we go back to our room?" Luffy asked, not really knowing what to do. He didn't really want to go back into the room where there was nothing to do, but he didn't want to stay out here where Teach would be. "We did say we would try and keep an eye on Teach, so maybe we should stay out here. If it gets to be too much we can go back to our room," Sabo said, the brothers nodding and heading to the rail where they resumed their usual positions. "So what was that all about?" Ace asked, not needing to give any more context. Sabo shrugged as he looked at the water with Luffy. "Well, let's just call it a bit of a test," Sabo said, confusing his brothers even more. "A test?" Luffy asked. Sabo nodded, tapping some more. "The pirates always said that if we were still hungry, or if we needed anything, then all we had to do was ask. Whether it's because they want to be nice or they're acting, I don't know, so I decided to ask for more food. If they're acting, then now is a good time to find out, seeing as we're about to leave. At lunch, you can have thirds and dinner, fourths. If they turn, then we'll know that we definitely shouldn't stay here any more than today. If they don't, then maybe we should stay." Sabo explained, ending a bit hesitantly at the suggestion of staying with the pirates, despite Teach being there. "You think we should stay?" Ace tapped, trying to keep the shock from showing. Sabo anticipated this, sighing as he replied. "It's not like I really want to, but Shanks was right, the Whitebeards offer protection we wouldn't be able to get anywhere else. It's also protection that we desperately need right now." Sabo tapped, looking up at the clouds as his mind fraught with the conflicting thoughts of wanting to leave, but knowing they should stay. "Is it really protection if there's someone with darkness here?" Ace questioned, still thinking that they should leave. How safe could safe be when there was darkness along with it? When that person with darkness seems to be keeping it hidden, probably. At this time we have no clue what Teach's goal is, or why he's pretending to be so friendly, so, for now, yes, this is the safest option. "I want to go to Shanks too, but if we do there will be more marines and more danger of getting caught," Sabo reasoned, knowing Teach was only a threat if he revealed to everyone here what his true intentions were. Sure, it was a ticking time bomb, but at least they wouldn't be near him when it went off, seeing as they planned on avoiding him as much as humanly possible. Luffy sat silently, letting his brothers discuss their options, while he paid attention to everyone else on the ship, noticing that breakfast was finishing up, and people were beginning to flood the deck, Teach being one of them. The man was on the other side of the deck. Luffy wouldn't be there still if the man was any closer, and he was making sure to memorize Teach's scent, so he would be able to pick it up if necessary. "So, we can take down a few lousy marines." Ace tapped, crossing his arms tightly over his chest, despite the fact that he was supposed to be sleeping. "It won't be a few lousy marines, Ace, it's gonna be a horde of trained, possibly deadly, marines. We can probably handle a few, but not how many the government will no doubt send after us." Sabo replied with a frown. Man, teach stunk. Bad. Luffy had never smelled a scent that was just inherently bad. He smelled a bit like cherry, which wasn't that bad, but also like oil. Cherry and oil. Those two scents did not mix well in Luffy's opinion. Then we get stronger. Ace said defiantly, still not willing to stay on this ship. We can only get so strong, Ace. Sabo replied a bit reluctantly, knowing that it was true. Sure, they could train, get stronger, but eventually, they wouldn't be able to get any stronger. They were only human. The conversation was cut short though because Luffy was suddenly spinning on the rail, jumping down and, very determinedly, heading towards Whitebeard. Sabo, without missing a beat, spun on the rail as well and followed after the youngest. Brushing Ace's shoulder with his hand, the eldest's eyes flew open as he stood and followed as well. There was no denying the fact that Teach had just been heading their way. What he wanted, none of the brothers knew, and they had no intention of waiting to find out. Out of the corner of his eye, Ace could see the man watching them head towards the captain, his expression unreadable, and Ace suppressed the scowl that wanted to show. They all noticed the looks they got, having surprised a few people with their sudden movement towards the captain, but no one made any moves to stop or intercept them, which was good. They reached the giant soon enough, the three of them sitting in front of him without a word, leaving the first move up to the captain. Whether they sat in silence, or they talked, would be up to Whitebeard himself. The man raised an eyebrow at the brothers' sudden appearance in front of him, but said nothing on the subject, looking back over the rest of the crew, like he had been before the brothers had joined him. Luffy watched the man carefully for a few minutes, and Ace and Sabo were just about to continue their previous conversation, when Luffy stood again from where he sat in between his brothers. Now everyone was confused as Luffy slowly, carefully, made his way closer to Whitebeard. He looked almost hesitant, reminding everyone watching of a rabbit, timid and afraid, yet moving slowly towards something it feared. Ace and Sabo, knowing Luffy was up to something, restrained themselves from causing a scene and grabbing Luffy. It didn't sit well with them that their brother was getting so close to someone so unknown to them, but this was someone that they all trusted for many different reasons, and they knew Luffy wouldn't be getting this close without a good reason himself. So they watched, tense and ready to fight if necessary, along with everyone else that was watching the interaction, which was everyone. When Luffy reached the captain's feet, he merely stared at the man's legs in front of him, seemingly thinking something over before slowly reaching his hand out and grabbing the man's pants, tugging on them a bit. Whitebeard seemed to understand what the boy wanted because he leaned down, putting a hand out in which Luffy climbed onto, again, a bit hesitantly. Whitebeard raised his hand up to his face, looking eye to eye with Luffy, Ace and Sabo, practically vibrating with nervous energy, as they watched Luffy stand in the hands of someone who could crush him in seconds. Luffy made a gesture, a get closer gesture, and Whitebeard brought the boy to his ear. Ace looked to Sabo, and the blonde was already one step ahead of him, straining his ears to listen to whatever it was Luffy was trying to tell the captain, hoping it wouldn't be anything bad. Everyone on the crew was doing the same, all wanting to know what exactly the youngest of the mysterious trio was going to tell their captain, but none of them had Sabo's hearing, so they didn't hear a single thing come from Luffy, not even a whisper. Sabo, however, heard it all, Whitebeard as well. The words made both parties frown, Ace frowning as well, only because he didn't know what was being said. The darkness is stronger. You need to watch Teach closer. He's gonna hurt someone and I don't want anyone getting hurt. While Luffy was telling Whitebeard about the darkness, Sabo had no clue, but there was no going back now. That didn't worry him as much as the fact that the darkness was getting worse though. To his credit, Whitebeard didn't question any of what Luffy had told him. He merely nodded, still frowning, and pulled Luffy back to look at him again. Thank you for the information. I'll look into it, Whitebeard said. The two stared at each other another second longer before Luffy smiled, not as white as normal, but still a smile. Good. I like you, Mr. Giant. Marco too. That's why I told you. Luffy said, turning to look at his brothers, the two of them understanding what Luffy was saying. He wanted them to know that he trusted them with information that all three of them were hesitant to give out. What did he tell him? Ace asked Sabo, still not knowing. Sabo quickly told Ace while Whitebeard laughed, a smile on his face as well. Gurarararara, that's good to hear, brat, we like you too. The captain exclaimed, bending down and setting Luffy back onto the ground. Luffy, still grinning, made his way back to his brothers, none of them wanting to leave Whitebeard knowing that Teach had been heading their way minutes ago. The morning quickly slipped into afternoon after that, the brothers not leaving Whitebeard's side as they listened to the captain tell stories. At one point he had talked to Marco in a hushed voice that only Sabo heard, but he had only told him what Luffy had told him, which none of the brothers minded. It meant that he was taking them seriously, that he might actually be keeping an eye out on Teach like they had told Marco to do. They had no doubts that Marco had already told Whitebeard about their earlier warning, they were actually hoping he did, but Sabo had been so stressed about other things, that he hadn't kept an ear out on the man to hear if he had or not. Lunch was being called by now, and the brothers continued to stick by Whitebeard, not heading into the galley until the giant himself did. They didn't want to take any chances, especially not with the spike in darkness that Teach had experienced when he headed their way. They didn't even want to try and figure out what that was about. Lunch was passing by quickly, as usual, the brothers finishing their meals quickly, as expected of them. By the way, I made these for you three. Aizo suddenly said as Ace and Luffy scraped the last bites of their food into their mouths. They all watched with curiosity as Aizo pulled out 3 cotton wristbands. They were all the same, a simple black with the white beard logo on the top of it. They each took one, though still confused. I thought it would be easier for you three to move around on islands if you didn't have to worry about your numbers showing, Aizo explained with a smile, pointing to the inside of his wrist, the same spot where the brothers had their numbers permanently tattooed into their skin. Realization dawned on the brothers, and they all felt a bit touched that Aizo had made something like that for them. Oh, thank you Aizo, you didn't have to. Sabo said, examining his wristband, flipping it around in his hands. Ace and Luffy did the same, Luffy smiling happily at the present, while Ace frowned, not quite sure how to take the gift. He wasn't used to people being nice to him without having a reason to be doing so. It was no problem, really. I'm glad you three like them. Aizo said, returning to his food, reminding Sabo of the little test he was running on the pirates. It was very thoughtful Aizo. Really, thank you. Thatch, could these two have some seconds please? Sabo asked, returning to his own meal as well. Thatch, who had been watching along with all the other commanders, smiled and nodded, jumping up. Coming right up Sabo. He said happily, practically sprinting off to the kitchen for more food. I swear, Thatch could only be happier if someone said they got him an unlimited supply of hair gel. Blenheim scoffed, watching his brother run off. The commanders laughed in agreement, Thatch returning with the seconds. Ace and Luffy ate the seconds up just as quickly as the first, and without missing a beat, Sabo turned to the chef with a smile. You wouldn't mind getting them thirds, would you? Sabo asked politely, wondering how the pirates would react. That was what this whole test was about after all. Seeing how they would react. Would they show their true colors and turn on them once they found just how much work they would have to put into accommodating the brothers, or would they show that they truly did just want to help and get them all the food they needed without question? So far, it was the latter. Thatch, although a bit shocked at the request, nodded, smiling and rushing off again. The commanders, though, remained looking shocked except for Aizo and Marco, who were still calmly eating, the captain as well, though Whitebeard was smiling a bit in amusement, according to Luffy. Once the thirds came and went the brothers left once more, not really knowing what to do now. Whitebeard wasn't out there yet, but neither was Teach. They could sit on the railing until he came out, but what if Teach finished first? Why don't we go take a bath? It's been a few days now, Sabo suggested with a sigh. It was true, even though they were much better in terms of staying clean, they had been a bit preoccupied lately to worry about hygiene. Ace and Luffy nodded their agreement, and the three stalked off toward the bathroom, chatting silently to each other, the previous argument of whether they should stay or go coming up again. You promised we could leave, no questions asked, so why are you stopping us? Ace asked, frustration building. Sabo frowned, already knowing how hypocritical he was being about this whole thing. I know, I'm sorry Ace, but that was when I was scared about the fact that someone with darkness was here. I didn't think long term and I wanted all of us off this ship, just like you do. But I've thought about it now, that's why I think we should stay. This place is nice, the pirates, so far, seem to be genuine in their feelings, and have only done things to help us, despite the many openings they've had to get rid of us one way or another. Sabo explained, the three slipping into the bathroom silently and shutting the door behind them. They had already stopped by their room for fresh clothes, and they grabbed some towels from a closet on their way back. Even if they seem nice it doesn't mean they are. Besides, darkness, remember Ace asked, and it was the same argument that they had had before, the two circling around each other with the same words and expressions they had already made. Luffy started to block out the tapping, worrying more about getting the tub filled with water, fighting the incoming memories of the tanks back at the facility as he did so. Almost mindlessly Ace dipped his hand into the water, ignoring the slightly draining effect it had on him, and heated his hand up, in turn, heating the water up to a much nicer, hotter temperature for the brothers. If the doctors did anything right it was giving Ace and Luffy an advantage when it came to their resistance to water despite their devil fruits. The tub wasn't big enough for all three of them, so Luffy went first, Sabo helping to wash the boys' hair. Even though they had a resistance it didn't last forever, and soon Ace was holding Luffy up to keep him from drooping under the water. It was slow going, and with all hands preoccupied there was no room for conversation unless the brothers spoke out loud. Slow going and silent. It was almost welcomed though, for the three to finally have something almost normal after all the stress they'd gone through in just the past day alone. To have something as simple and mundane as bathing to preoccupy their time was almost therapeutic for them, allowing a tension that had been present in them just disappear. Once Luffy was all clean Ace went next, the youngest drying himself off so that he could help when all of Ace's strength was sapped from the water. Luffy relished in the piece rolling off of Ace and Sabo, a nice contrast to the worry, anger, frustration, fear that had taken hold of them for the past couple days. peace, happiness, and warmth. If Luffy had his way, those would be the emotions that Ace and Sabo would always feel. Sabo's turn came as quick as Ace's went, and without having to worry about his strength disappearing at the touch of the water, he finished the fastest. Ace helped in drying Luffy's hair and getting the both of them dressed while they waited for Sabo. The blonde brother finished soon enough, getting out and drying off, rubbing a towel on his head. I guess we spent quite a while in here. It sounds like dinner's almost done, Sabo said as he headed towards the door. He could hear the chefs wrapping things up, making last-second sauces, and pulling out finished food. Is Whitebeard out there? Ace asked, not wanting to go out on deck if he wasn't. From the sounds of it. Yeah. He's talking to Marco and Thatch. Something about upping the food budget again. Sabo said with a smile. He felt a little bad about using up so much of the crew's resources, but chances were, they were leaving. Even though Sabo could be pretty persuasive, he didn't know if he would be able to convince Ace to stay with the Whitebeards. He was sure he could get Luffy to understand that they should stay, but Ace was fighting tooth and nail to leave, and with good reason. If they really do want us here, then they should be prepared. Ace said with a shrug, the three of them leaving the bathroom and heading to the deck, giving Teach a wide berth. Ace noticed that the man lit their way, but didn't make a move to come near them again. It was a straight walk to Whitebeard's chair, the three of them plopping down in front of him without hesitation. The captain merely glanced at them and smiled before continuing his conversation with Marco and Thatch. Why don't we do that then? At the next meeting, we can discuss it further. Whitebeard said, the commanders nodding in agreement as they headed off, the two of them beginning their own conversation as Whitebeard turned to give them his attention. Dinner should be done soon, so why don't I tell you about the time I traveled through a storm and nearly capsized? Whitebeard asked, Luffy's face lighting up at the mention of his story, while Ace and Sabo settled down, ready to listen as well. It would be nice if this was something they could get used to. At dinner, Sabo asked for not only seconds, nor thirds, but fourths. He was sure that some of the commanders broke after that. Thatch, to his credit, only smiled happily and rushed off each time, returning with equally large amounts of food for his brothers with bottomless pits. Sabo was actually pretty surprised no one had questioned their eating habits more. When, by the mention of fourths, no one turned on them, Sabo took that as a good sign. A sign that the pirates really were genuine when it came to wanting to keep the brothers happy and comfortable, just because they wanted to be nice, not because they had ulterior motives they wanted to fill. Of course, this didn't mean that the brothers trusted the pirates. After all, it was easy to feed someone, but harder to put up with them for long periods of time, so the longer they went without turning on them, the more they would trust this wasn't all an elaborate trap. Dinner was finished by the brothers at a much slower pace than normal, now that they were actually eating their fill. By the time they were done, some of the faster eaters were also beginning to finish as well. Leaving the galley, the brothers headed straight to their room, the three anticipating the debate that was once again going to come up once they got there. They had promised Shanks they would stay another day, and they had, so now they had to decide if they would stay or not. Depending on how this conversation went determined whether the brothers would stay or go. Meanwhile, in the galley, the commanders were looking where the brothers had just left, still a bit surprised at how much they had just seen Ace and Luffy shovel into their mouths. They knew they could eat so much. King Du asked as he ate his own food. Namor scoffed, pushing some food along his plate with his fork. Who knew anyone could eat that much? Namor countered, some laughing in agreement. It was surprising though, Aizo commented, having been surprised by it as well, but was sure to contain his expression, not wanting to make the brothers uncomfortable seeing as they were opening up to them a bit, even if it was just them eating food. Did they always eat so much? Haruta asked, looking at the stack of plates Ace and Luffy left behind. They never said anything about it before, Jiro said. Yeah, but they also didn't tell us when they were practically starving in the infirmary. Thatch said as he too glanced at the dishes. They're probably getting more comfortable around us then, right? Flamingo asked, a bit hopeful. Probably. They have been hanging around Pops more lately. Vista mentioned, everyone, looking over at Whitebeard who smiled to his children. Whether they're becoming more comfortable around us or not, don't think that they're suddenly healed, my children. What they've been through will take time to work through, but this is a step in the right direction. Whitebeard said, everyone at the table nodding their agreement. By the way, what did Luffy tell you today, Pops? Atmos asked. Whitebeard and Marco shared a quick look before they both returned to eating their food. It was nothing important, son, but I think that was also another step in the right direction, Whitebeard said cryptically, feeling a mix of pride and happiness that the brothers were opening up to them, but also a bit of worry for whatever Luffy's warning meant. They had had Teach on their crew for years, decades, and they had never noticed anything off about him, but now suddenly they were being told he would cause trouble for them. Whitebeard didn't think that Luffy was lying. He believed the boy truly felt something bad was going to happen. Maybe he even knew for certain that it would, but that didn't calm Whitebeard anymore. It just meant that they had an issue that they didn't know how to resolve quite yet. He couldn't just turn on one of his children without good reason, so for now, he would keep a close eye on Teach like he had promised. If anything did happen, he would be ready for it. Marco as well. The first mate ate his food silently, but he was having many of the same thoughts as his captain, wondering what they should do about Teach. Maybe they should try and get the brothers to explain what would happen, that is, if they even knew. But they could ask how they knew something would happen in the first place, but the first time Marco asked he hadn't gotten much of an answer. Like Whitebeard, he believed the brothers, but he didn't know how to handle the situation, especially when they knew so little on what they were supposed to be looking out for. Was Teach going to betray them? Was he going to betray the brothers? Was he going to hurt someone? Was he going to mess up a mission? The unknowns only proved to make him more worried than anything, so he decided to push them aside, instead focusing on what he could do, which wasn't much. Whitebeard and Marco would keep an eye on Teach. They wouldn't let whatever the brothers were sensing happen anytime soon. Chapter 45. To stay or not to stay. Waking up the next day, the brothers found themselves heading straight to where they knew Marco was. They had gotten up a bit later than they normally would, more tired than usual due to staying up late last night, arguing over whether they should stay or go. Ace was, of course, adamant over leaving. Sabo was not as adamant about staying, but thought it was more beneficial to stay rather than leave. Luffy didn't mention his opinion once throughout the whole argument. He had sat silently and watched as his brothers fought back and forth over which was the safer option for them. It wasn't that he didn't have an opinion, because he did, but he didn't want to force his brothers to stay or leave, because it was what he wanted. To be honest, he didn't really mind one way or the other. He adored Shanks, obviously, but he was also starting to grow attached to the Whitebeard pirates as well. With Teach thrown into the equation, though, it made things a bit more complicated. If they left, Luffy would be comforted by the thought that they had warned Marco and Whitebeard about the man, told them about the darkness. He knew the two of them believed him, and he had noticed that they were actually watching the man closer than anyone else on the crew. All in all, Luffy would be just fine staying or going. As long as he was with his brothers, he would be happy. He would fight as many Marines as he had to, eat as little as needed, sleep on the uncomfortable floor, stay awake all night, anything. As long as it meant he and his brothers stayed together, he would be happy. So Ace and Sabo argued. There was no anger in the argument, frustration sure, but nothing that would cause an actual fight. Ace knew why Sabo wanted to stay, and Sabo knew why Ace wanted to leave. There was a good reason for both options, but which one was the best was a much harder decision to come to. Hence why they were tired after nearly pulling an all-nighter. Marco was where they knew he would be. Right next to Whitebeard. There was a bit of a routine to the Whitebeard pirates, one the brothers easily picked up on over the course of the 3 weeks they had been on the ship. Yes, it had been 3 weeks already. Time flies. Almost every morning, Marco would be right beside Whitebeard. Whether it was to give out chores, report something to the captain, or just stand idly by, the first mate would always be there. After a couple hours he would leave and head off elsewhere, but that wasn't the point. The point was, they knew exactly where the man they needed to talk was. So they went there. Marco, Whitebeard, good morning. Sabo greeted, the three of them standing in front of both Whitebeard and Marco. It wasn't that strange for the crew to see the brothers there now. After all, they had spent nearly the entire day yesterday glued to the spot in front of Whitebeard's chair. Good morning. Whitebeard and Marco greeted back. Instead of the brothers sitting like most expected, they continued standing, Sabo turning to give Marco his attention. I was wondering, could we give Shanks another call? I'm sorry to ask about this again, but we had a bit of a revelation if you will on something he mentioned last time, and thought we should tell him about it. Sabo explained with a smile. Marco looked to Whitebeard who nodded. No problem, Yuri. I'll take you there. Marco said, already beginning to walk away. The brothers followed, Sabo thanking Whitebeard as they passed him. It was, for the most part, silent as they walked, and once they entered the hallway leading to the room they needed it went silent. There was no more chatter from surrounding pirates filling up the space. What have you and Red Hair been talking about? You don't have to tell me if you don't want, Yuri. Marco said, more to make conversation than anything, but he would be lying if he said he wasn't curious. Sabo's smile never wavered though. He expected this to be a question that the first mate would ask. After all, they had been having quite a few conversations with the captain now in a short period of time. Nothing much, but Shanks had an idea that he wanted us to give some input on, Sabo explained easily without giving too much detail to the made-up story. Marco nodded, accepting the answer as they reached the door. Marco said a quick goodbye and headed off, leaving the brothers alone as they entered the room. Before we call, are we all 100% sure this is what we want to do? Now's the time to change our minds. Sabo said, and even though he was saying it, he knew no one would speak up. This had been a long, thought-out decision. There wasn't any more to argue on the matter. When no one said anything, Sabo nodded, picking up the snail phone and dialing Shanks' number. Waiting for the captain to answer was a bit nerve-wracking because once he did and they told him their decision, that would be it. Sure, they could change their mind, but it would be more hassle than it would be worth. Red-haired Shanks here, who's this? Shanks answered, someone yelling at him in the background. Sabo smiled a bit despite his nerves and pulled the speaker a bit closer to his mouth. Shanks, it's us, Sabo replied, not needing to say anything more as understanding shone on the snail's face. Ah, my 3 favorite brothers. So, I assume you're calling to give me your decision, Shanks said. Sabo swallowed, glancing at his brothers for confirmation that this is what they were doing. A nod from Ace reassured him in their decision, and he nodded. We are. Maybe we should just ask for more information, Yuri. After all, they're the ones who spoke to us about it first. Marco said in a hushed tone as he and his father watched over the crew, spending most of their time watching Teach than anyone else. If we do that we could scare them off, my son. We need to be patient. Obviously, they know something we don't. Whatever this darkness is that Luffy mentioned, it's nothing good, and not only will we be watching out, but the brothers will as well. They'll know what to look for, and I'm confident that they'll warn us again if anything is going to happen soon. Whitebeard said calmly. Marco frowned, staying silent for a second. Do you think one of them has an ability? A devil fruit maybe that lets them see the future or something, Yuri? Marco asked. Whitebeard frowned in thought. I don't know, son. The youngest fell in the water a little while ago though, correct? Whitebeard asked. Marco nodded, thinking back to when Luffy had fallen overboard. Yeah, but he treaded water for a bit before Namor got him, Yuri. Ace and Sabo didn't jump in after him though, so there's a chance that one of them has it. Marco said. It is a possibility. For now though, it's only speculation. Who knows, maybe they just have strong intuition. All we can do right now is watch and hope for the best. When the 3 of them are more comfortable, I'm sure they'll give out more information on the topic. Whitebeard said. By the way, did the navigator say when we'll be reaching Sabati? Whitebeard asked, glancing up into the sky. They had hit a bit of a dry patch in terms of wind, and it had slowed their progress to the archipelago. They're estimating another day or 2 of travel. They think the winds should be picking up, but even in paradise the weather can be unpredictable, especially this close to the New World. Marco said, crossing his arms as he looked into the sky as well. Whitebeard laughed heartily. You don't have to tell me about that, son. I've traveled these seas for far too long for that to be new information. Whitebeard laughed. Marco grinned at his captain's joy and nodded. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed the 3 mysterious brothers themselves coming back out onto the deck from where they had been talking to Shanks. They were tapping again, or Sabo was at least. The other 2 were beside him, and Marco noticed that once Sabo stopped tapping, Ace started. I see what you meant before, Marco, Whitebeard said softly. Not to hide the fact that he was talking about the brothers, but more because he was thinking as he spoke. The first mate peeked at his father before nodding. Both of them wore frowns as they thought about what the tapping could be about, but no matter how many times Marco revisited the subject, he didn't get any closer to figuring out what it was. It didn't matter because the brothers crossed the deck in a timely manner, disappearing once again into the depths of the Moby. They had headed into the hallways that would lead them to the commander's rooms, as well as the room that they were currently residing in, so Marco assumed they would be there until breakfast was ready. Those boys sure are a mystery, Whitebeard said with a smile. What now? Ace muttered. They were walking through the empty hall towards their room, having just finished their conversation with Shanks. Well, we continue like we planned before all of this happened. Sabo sighed out quietly as they walked right past their room and continued down the hall. After much debate about how many Marines they could take down, how long they could stay awake until they became non-functional, how long they could go without food before losing their strength, they had come to the agreement that they were more likely safe on the Whitebeard's ship rather than Shanks. We have already planned on staying indefinitely, so why should we change anything now? We just have to take into account the fact that there's someone with darkness here, that's all. Sabo said in a hushed voice, keeping an ear out for anyone who could possibly be eavesdropping on them. We still get to eat lots of food, right? Luffy questioned, remembering how he had finally been able to eat his fill for once. Sabo nodded. Don't worry, Lou, you can still eat lots. Actually, I think now's a good time for the next test. Sabo said after a second of thought. Ace and Luffy gave each other a look of confusion before turning to look at Sabo, who still looked to be thinking as he glanced around the halls. What do you mean? Ace asked, and he was responded to with their silent language, tipping them off that there was either someone getting too close, or this was something Sabo didn't want to chance anyone hearing. The pirates didn't react like we thought they would to the fact that you 2 eat a lot, right? Sabo asked, the brothers nodding. Yeah, they didn't get all mad and kick us out. Luffy confirmed, smiling a little. He liked the pirates, except for Teach of course, and the fact that they still seemed to accept the brothers, even after knowing how much they could eat, made Luffy like them even more. He sure hoped they weren't acting like Ace, and Sabo worried they were. Right, so either they've got lots of patience, or they really aren't acting. So, why not step it up, give them a perfect opportunity to get rid of one of us, and see what they do? Sabo asked. Ace frowned at the thought, wondering where Sabo was going with this, while Luffy looked even more confused. Get rid of us? Luffy asked. Sabo nodded, looking around again before turning down what the trio found to be a dead-end hole. That's right. We can give them a chance to easily get rid of one of us and see what they do. Sabo said, keeping an ear out for anyone coming. What do you have in mind? Ace asked skeptically. He trusted that his blonde brother wouldn't put any one of them in actual harm's way, but that didn't mean Ace would like whatever this plan of his was. I think if one of us gets lost, Sabo began, already raising alarms in the eldest's head, and have someone find them, then we can see what they would do. The other two would be nearby in case they did try something, Sabo explained. Ace frowned at the thought. But didn't we already kind of do that? Ace questioned, remembering the time Luffy had gotten lost, for real. Yes, but Marco and Thatch found him. We already knew from the start that they were relatively good people. They helped Luffy and kept their promises after all, but I'm talking about a stranger. There are plenty of people on the Moby we haven't met yet, so why not have it be one of them? Sabo asked. He could tell Ace didn't like the plan, and Luffy didn't seem all that thrilled either, but this was something they needed to do. They couldn't just keep hanging around these pirates forever walking on eggshells. They needed to know their intentions before they were able to finally get comfortable around any of them. Who's getting lost? Ace asked, even though it looked like he already knew the answer. Sabo looked a bit hesitant now, rubbing the back of his head. To be honest, I was thinking Luffy, Sabo admitted, Ace's frown deepening at the thought. Nope. Not happening. Ace denied out loud, shaking his head at the thought. Sabo sighed, already expecting this reaction. Ace, come on, it makes the most sense. Think about it, I can't go because we'll need my hearing in case something goes wrong, and even though we told people we don't have fighting experience, you still look like you won't go down without a fight. It would deter anyone from actually doing anything. If we send Luffy, they'll think he's defenseless and will more than likely do something around him, Sabo explained. Everyone went silent now. No talking, no tapping, no noise, nothing. Ace sat, thinking over everything Sabo had just said. You and I wouldn't be far away. If the pirate does turn, then all Luffy has to do is ask for help. I'll hear him and we can run in and save the day, Sabo explained, and Ace had to admit that it was the best plan. Fine. Where are we doing this? Luffy wandered the hull silently, looking around in wonder as he did. They hadn't really explored this section of the Moby that much, and now that he had the chance he was taking in everything he could. It wasn't much different from all the other hulls, but this one had its own sense that Luffy had only briefly smelled before. Footsteps ahead of him clued him into the reason he was in this hull in the first place. Ace and Sabo were trailing pretty far back, not even visible if Luffy turned around. They had moved to this hallway because according to Sabo, this hull was more frequented than the others. This hull too because ahead of him, Luffy could see a pirate walking his way. The quick shock of the man's emotions told Luffy that he was safe for now. There was nothing bad or malicious, just calm and neutrality. Once the man was close enough that he noticed Luffy, he noticed confusion worming its way into the man's emotions, and even a little bit of worry. Luffy, right? The man asked a bit hesitantly, looking around the empty hull. Luffy nodded, tilting his head a bit as he observed the man. He wasn't doing anything to harm him yet. So far so good. Where are your brothers? The man asked, and Luffy could feel a bit of fear beginning to take hold in the man now. That was weird. I dunno, Luffy said in a small voice. He was always told he was a bad liar, and it was true, but Sabo had been teaching him how to lie better, so it wouldn't be so easy for people to figure it out. He had told him to keep some truth in his lies, and Luffy did. He didn't really know where his brothers were, he just knew they were behind him somewhere. So you're lost? The man asked. Luffy nodded, opting to not speaking on that one as he looked around as if he had no clue where he was, but really he didn't want the man to see how much he was sweating from the tiny lie. Oh well, why don't I take you back to the deck? We could look for them there, or find Marco or Pops, the man said, seemingly a bit unsure. Luffy nodded again, feeling happy that the man hadn't turned on him like Ace thought he would. Luffy knew that most people on board were good people, but he didn't know whether they were just good actors or actually meant well. Well, it's this way. Oh, my name's Kaseki, by the way, Kaseki said, realizing he hadn't introduced himself. Luffy nodded once more and Kaseki turned, leading him out of the hull and back toward the deck. Luffy smiled as they walked, feeling the worry Ace and Sabo had been feeling dim a bit. I like you, Kaseki, Luffy said as they reached the door. Kaseki looked a bit shocked at the boy's words, but his shock quickly turned into a smile. Thanks, Luffy, I like you too, he said as they walked out onto the deck. Luffy shivered a bit when he noticed Teach was right by the door they had just exited and felt his stomach drop, throat tightening. How had he not realized that the darkness was so close by? Teach seemed to notice that Luffy was by himself at that same moment, and Luffy grimaced when he felt the darkness get stronger. Before Teach had a chance to say anything, Luffy bolted over to where he knew safety was, smiling brightly in relief. Marco. Luffy cheered happily, using the relief he felt from being away from Teach to sound happy as he charged toward the man. Marco turned with a look of confusion and shock on his face, and Luffy had to stop himself from ramming into the man, remembering what he was supposed to be doing in the first place. Luffy, where are your brothers? Marco asked, looking around the deck for them. Even though the crew had seen Luffy alone a few times, it was never without good reason. I got lost again, and Kaseki found me and helped me get out of those long hallways, and then I saw you. Luffy said cheerfully, the lie rolling off his tongue easily with how relieved he felt at being near warmth rather than darkness. Understanding shone on Marcos's face and he sighed, smiling a little. Why don't we go find them then? I'm sure they're worried about you, Marco said as he glanced around, and Luffy realized something. He could feel Marco using his haki. He would definitely have to tell Ace and Sabo about that later. Come on, Yuri, I think they're this way, Marco said as he began leading the way. Luffy nodded, sidling close to the first mate when he realized they would have to pass Teach again. If Marco noticed that Luffy was practically clinging to his side, he didn't say anything about it. Luffy nearly sighed in relief when the door to the deck closed behind them, and they were alone again in the hall. So, what were you three doing? Were you looking for a specific room? Marco asked curiously. Luffy shook his head, smiling. We were exploring. He exclaimed happily as he followed his brother's waves back to where they were. Marco nodded, and Luffy forgot that the man was supposed to be leading them, not the other way around. Slowing down a bit so that Marco would be leading again, Luffy looked around, discreetly smelling the air around them. Marco, is breakfast ready yet? Luffy asked, mouth drooling at the delicious smells wafting their way. Marco glanced at the boy, a small smile on his face as he nodded. Should be soon, Yuri. He said as they turned a corner. That's good. I'm hungry. Luffy said matter-of-factly. They were only walking for another minute or so, turning a few corners when they heard Ace and Sabo. I'm telling you, he went this way. Are you sure? He doesn't even know what's over here, wouldn't he go back towards the rooms? This is Luffy we're talking about, he goes towards what he doesn't know. True, but... Ace, Sabo. Luffy cheered happily, jumping away from Marco's side and running into his brother's arms. Luffy. See, told you. Ace said, sticking his tongue out to Sabo who retaliated with his own. You alright, Luffy? Sabo asked, checking over Luffy quickly. Luffy nodded, still grinning. MHM. Kaseki found me and took me to the deck, and I found Marco, and then Marco found you guys. Luffy said, telling an entire story within a sentence. Sabo laughed, Ace smiling, and the two turned to Marco. Thank you once again for helping our brother. He gets lost easy. Sabo said as Luffy slid in between Ace and Sabo, taking their hands. I see that. It was no problem, really, Yuri. See you three at breakfast. Marco says, waving it off as he turns to head back to the deck. See you there, Sabo responds, the three watching Marco. When he was out of sight, the two eldest sighed in relief. I didn't think Teach would be right there. Sorry, Lou. Sabo apologized, remembering how he had heard Teach head right to the door. Luffy exited with Kaseki. The man had been across the deck when this whole thing started, but once Luffy was headed to the deck, Teach headed to the door. It didn't sit well with Sabo. It's okay, cause I saw Marco and I went to him before Teach could do anything. Luffy said, even though he was still a bit shaken up at the memory of how close he had been to Teach. In any case, the test was a success. Kaseki sounded a bit off, but he didn't try anything. He brought you to Marco. Sabo said, remembering all of Kaseki's stuttering. He was scared for some reason when he saw you weren't with me. He was worried too and confused, but he was nice. Luffy said. Sabo and Ace raised an eyebrow at that. That's weird. Anyway, breakfast is ready, let's head to the galley. What's the next test? Ace asked from his spot beside Luffy. They were once again in front of Whitebeard, the captain talking to some nurses about IVs and alcohol. Most of it went over Ace and Luffy's heads, so they had instead started talking to each other, while Sabo listened, finding out that the captain was actually quite sick. Dunno. Sabo's good at making those. Luffy answered as he tried to figure out what the nurses were trying to put into the captain's arm. He liked Whitebeard, and he didn't like nurses. He had found himself watching all of the nurses' movements, making sure the nurses didn't try to hurt the giant on purpose, or try and do tests on him. Sabo? Ace asked, noticing that the blonde was also watching the nurses' every movement. Apparently old habits die hard. Even though none of the brothers were being worked on by the nurses, they couldn't help but watch their movements for any sign of wrongdoing. Whitebeard was someone they all liked enough to stay by, and if nurses started messing with him, they wouldn't be happy. Fine. We'll watch more nurses. Ace said, but even he had been watching their movements already. The three went silent as they watched, a few commanders coming by every now and then to talk to Whitebeard, but none of them staying. Right now, Thatch, Marco, and Fawcett were there, discussing Kami knew what with the captain. Does that hurt? Luffy suddenly asked. He didn't feel any pain coming from the captain, but weren't the nurses poking needles into him? Luffy thought that the liquids in those needles would make him hurt, or make him sleepy, like the liquids the doctors at the facility give him. Whitebeard smiled, shaking his head. No, they don't hurt, Whitebeard assured, allowing the nurses to continue injecting things into him. But when we got shots they would hurt or make us sleepy, Luffy said, tilting his head in confusion. These are good shots, Luffy, they help people get better. We got bad shots, they weren't supposed to help us get better. Sabo explained as best he could without giving too much away to those listening. Luffy frowned, seeming to think about something. So they're the good shots. Like the ones they gave me and you when we got really sick? Luffy asked, remembering the time that Sabo and G had died, but the doctors had given them both a bunch of shots that helped them. Exactly, they helped us get better. That's what those shots are doing. They're helping Whitebeard, Sabo said. Luffy seemed to understand. Oh, okay. Does that mean you're sick, Mr. Whitebeard? Luffy asked, wondering if that was the case. Or was he dying? When Sabo and Luffy got the shots, it was because they were dying and they needed help. Panic started to rise in him at this revelation and his eyes whitened, breathing picking up. Whitebeard couldn't die, he really liked the giant old man. He was a good person and had lots of warmth and kept him and his brothers safe. Noticing the sudden panic, Ace and Sabo both grabbed Luffy's hands, trying to calm him down. They weren't quite sure what had brought the sudden attack on, but they knew it probably wasn't anything good. Some of the pirates around them had noticed Luffy's panic and stopped to watch, while the commanders and Whitebeard watched with a mixture of worry and confusion. You're not gonna die, right? You're not getting shots because you're dying, are you? Luffy asked fearfully, only seconds away from jumping up and doing anything he could think of to keep the man in front of him from dying. Ace and Sabo suddenly understood where the panic was coming from. After all, Luffy didn't have many good experiences with shots. The only time anyone around him got good shots was when they were so sick they were dying, and in their cases, dead. Don't worry, brat, I'm not dying anytime soon. Whitebeard laughed, all of the brothers letting out sighs of relief at the words. Luffy calmed down considerably and nodded. It was silent now as the nurses began working again, the commanders eventually continuing their conversation with Whitebeard. So Sabo? Ace sapped eventually, once they had all calmed down a bit. What? Sabo asked, still watching the nurses along with his brothers. New plan? Ace asked, wondering what the next one would be. The pirates had to be acting, and the fact that they hadn't done anything yet was a bit unnerving. A soft sigh left Sabo as the nurses finished up, packing needles in bags and removing gloves. I don't know yet. Give me some time to think about one. Almec. I heard you ran into little Luffy earlier, Kaseki. A man said as he and Kaseki sat in a circle with a few other men, drinking. It was a nice night out, and they weren't on watch, so it was as good a time as ever to hang out, drink, and play cards. Oh, yeah, I did. Kaseki said, laughing a little. His friend raised an eyebrow at him. So, what was he like? Man, I've tried talking to him and his brothers since they got here, but every time I tried they just walk off or completely ignore me. The man complained, his friends making noises of agreement. Kaseki shrugged. He was okay, I guess. He was lost, so I brought him to the deck, and Commander Marco took care of him. Kaseki explained. The hero Kaseki, helping out kids whenever possible. Another man joked, patting Kaseki on the back. Everyone laughed at that as the dealer dealt out everyone's hand. So, did you talk to him? The first man asked. Kaseki, once again, laughed, this time sheepishly. Actually, I was too scared, Kaseki said a bit hesitantly, already knowing he was going to be endlessly made fun of for this. Scared? Of what? He's just a kid. The man across from his said, everyone laughing again. Yeah, but it wasn't him I was scared of. It's his brothers. You've seen those glares Ace gives. I wouldn't be surprised if he could pack a punch, and I do not want to be on the receiving end of it, because I accidentally made Luffy sad or something. Kaseki defended, and suddenly everyone understood a bit more, nods going around as they remembered the glares Ace would give whenever someone looked their way. I see what you mean, but you were scared of a kid. Kaseki groaned. Sabo made a noise that was somewhere between a laugh and a snort. His brothers looked at him with confusion. What was that? Ace asked, wondering what noise had just come from Sabo. The blonde shook his head, walking over to their bed and laying down. Nothing, someone was just proving my point. Chapter 46. The big question. It was at lunch the next day that Sabo finally thought up a new plan to get the pirates to turn on them. Even though the whole point of this was to find out whether the pirates were acting or not, the three brothers found themselves getting more and more desperate for the pirates to finally turn on them. It was unnerving for the pirates to keep smiling, to keep the niceties going, to be helpful and accommodating. Everyone the brothers had ever met always had other intentions when being nice to the brothers. No one was nice without reason, whether it was because they wanted to trick them, trap them, lure them into a false sense of security, or hurt them. They didn't count Makino or Emily. So, what's the new plan? Ace asked as they left the galley. Ace was itching to get the pirates to show their true colors. He didn't believe for one second that they were all actually this nice and helpful. They were pirates after all. The only thing I can think to do is to try and get them mad and see how they react, but there's not much we can do to get them mad without picking a fight with them, which is not what we want to do. Sabo started, Ace and Luffy nodding in agreement. Because of that, we have to do something that would be annoying, and would give them an excuse to get mad if they wanted. Sabo continued. What's that? Ace asked, wanting to know. That's the easy part. The crew has chores, right? We've seen them cleaning the deck plenty of times, and they always have those buckets of water with them when they do. All we have to do is knock one over and see how they react. Sabo explained as they walked towards their room. Because the brothers were eating more during meal times, they were finishing later than they used to, but they also had more energy, and it was easier for them to do more without getting tired. Despite this, Sabo still had them head to their room because, normally, they would sit with Whitebeard and listen to stories, but seeing as they had this plan, it would look weird if they suddenly stood up and went and knocked over a bucket with seemingly no reason. It had to look like an accident. Once they reached the room, they wasted a bit of time just hanging out. Luffy laid on the bed, in a weird in-between state of asleep but awake, and Ace was pacing, his nerves still bouncing over the fact that this could be the time that the pirates finally attack. Sabo shared Ace's nerves, both of them still more than a bit confused, as to why the pirates hadn't done anything to turn on them after all this time. They waited in there about an hour before Sabo heard cleaning supplies being taken out, and buckets being filled with water. Another few minutes and everyone was in position, cleaning the deck while others milled around them. Alright, it's time to go, Sabo announced, Ace going and getting Luffy up. The boy was a bit groggy and disoriented, but got up anyways, following Ace and Sabo to the door as they headed out. The walk was quick and within a few minutes, they were out on deck once again. Ace could see the people swabbing the deck, along with the buckets that littered the area around them. Ace and Sabo didn't even have a chance to pretend to stumble over there and knock one over, because well, frankly, Luffy did it for them. Apparently, the young teen was so groggy and disoriented that, while rubbing his eyes, he had drifted away from his brothers, and managed to trip right over one of the buckets himself, both him and the bucket toppling to the floor. There were a few gasps as people noticed the boy fall, and Ace and Sabo rushed over to their brother's side. They couldn't get there before he managed to fall face first into the water he knocked over, but they helped him up regardless, Ace using his shirt to wipe off the water falling down Luffy's face, while Sabo turned to gauge the reactions of those around them. "We're sorry for this, I guess Luffy was more tired than we thought," Sabo said truthfully. Even though this had been their plan in the first place, it hadn't gone exactly how they thought it would. "Oh, it's no problem. Is he alright?" That was Sinful. The pirate who had been next to the bucket said, sending a worried look to Luffy. "He's fine. Come on Luffy, let's go change your clothes," Ace said, noticing that quite a bit of water had gotten on Luffy, enough to drain the boy if they didn't change soon. Luffy followed as Ace led them away, while Sabo gave a polite smile, beginning to follow them as well. "Again, sorry about the mess," Sabo called as they walked off. It looked like most of the pirates were too shocked to even know what to do, making it the perfect time for the brothers to leave. "Well, can't say I expected that," Sabo muttered as the door shut behind them. He turned to look at Luffy, noticing his black hair was dripping, and his clothes were thoroughly soaked from where he landed in the puddle. "Either way we did it. Now we just have to wait for those bastards to come running after us," Ace said, still entirely convinced that the pirates were acting and this would be the last straw. Sabo looked at Ace for a minute but said nothing, instead turning to face forward again. "The plan worked, right?" Luffy suddenly asked, looking much more awake than he had been previously. Sabo chuckled a little but nodded. "Yes Lu, it worked. You could have told us you were still too tired," Sabo said, remembering that Luffy had seemed groggy getting up, but not groggy enough to go stumbling over buckets. "I wasn't, but the cleaning stuff hurt my nose and gave me a headache, and I got confused for a second," Luffy explained, scrunching his nose a few times at the memory. Ace and Sabo suddenly felt bad, not realizing that Luffy had been asleep enough that his senses would be overloaded once they walked out of their room. "It's fine, I didn't know either. I didn't think I fell asleep," Luffy said with a shrug, noticing the guilt that came rolling off of his brothers. This stopped Ace and Sabo from saying anything, but they still felt a bit guilty as they entered their shared room. Sabo went to the closet to get more clothes, while Ace helped get Luffy out of his soaked clothes. "So, I guess that plan didn't work. What's next?" Ace asked. "Ace, we can't just throw one thing after another at them. Even if they are attacking they can still get mad. Anyone would if we kept pushing," Sabo explained with a sigh as he pulled out his shirt and pants, turning around and helping Luffy into them. "Yeah, but I don't like it. They're just so. Nice?" Sabo asked, seeing that Ace was having a hard time with the word. Ace shot him a glare, grumbling. "Pirates aren't nice. Pirates are supposed to be mean and greedy, not nice and helpful," Ace said, and Sabo had to agree with him on that one. It wasn't every day that you saw nice pirates. To be fair, doctors are supposed to be nice and helpful, not mean and greedy, Sabo countered, making Ace laugh spitefully. "I think we live in opposite world then. Or we just have really shitty luck," Ace said as he walked to the bed and flopped onto it, face buried in the pillows. Sabo laughed while Luffy looked confused. "Opposite world?" he asked, not knowing what Ace meant by that. The blonde shook his head, ruffling Luffy's damp hair. "It's nothing Lu, Ace is just a bit confused," Sabo said before frowning and looking to the door. "Or he might just be right," he said as he walked up to the door, looking ready to open it. Now Ace and Luffy were both confused as they watched Sabo's back. "Huh? What do you mean?" Ace asked as he sat up and turned to look at Sabo. Well, it would seem that Marco's on his way over here. Whether it's because he's mad or because he's worried about Luffy, who knows? Sabo explained with a shrug as he listened to the footsteps get closer. Luffy moved to the door as well, so he could get a better read on Marco's feelings. Not mad. A little bit of worry, but it's not why he's coming. He's calm. Luffy said softly in case Marco was close enough to hear. So this is it then? They're turning. Ace asked, sitting up in a defensive position, ready for a fight. We don't know that yet, Ace, calm down. Sabo hissed quietly, glaring at the hot-headed teen. Ace glared back but didn't drop his position. Shaking his head, Sabo turned back to the door, opening it right as a knock resounded in the room. Luffy backed away as the door opened, moving beside Ace while Sabo looked out. Hello, Commander, Sabo said politely, smiling to Marco as he did. Marco nodded his head in greeting, noticing that he couldn't see in the room like always when Sabo answered. Hello Sabo, is Luffy alright, Yuri? Marco asked, to which Sabo replied with a nod. He was just a little disoriented after his nap. The blonde responded easily. That's good. I came because Pops wanted to talk to you three. Marco said, getting to the point. Sabo's smile remained on his face, though it was a bit strained now. Oh? Alright, we'll head right over. Sabo answered, Marco nodding. He'll be in the room with the snail phones when you're ready, Yuri. The first mate said as Sabo began closing the door. Thank you, Commander, Sabo said as he shut the door completely, turning to Ace and Luffy with a frown. So they are turning. Ace said in an I told you so manner. Sabo rolled his eyes, but he was also beginning to feel that way. If they are, we need to be ready. Luffy, you're awake now, right? The smells won't be too much for you. Sabo asked, Luffy shaking his head. No, I'm fine now. The youngest responded, feeling a bit tense at the prospect that the pirates were turning on them. Good. If they are turning on us, then don't fight Whitebeard. He's too strong for all of us put together. Focus on getting a snail phone and getting out of there. We should be able to run to one of the lifeboats we saw and can call Shanks on the way. Sabo said, quickly coming up with a plan. Ace and Luffy listened carefully, nodding their agreement as they did. Well, let's go get this over with then. Ace said, wanting to release all his pent-up energy from these past weeks. The stress of waiting for the pirates to attack was enough to make Ace go insane. Fine, don't be so eager to run into these things, Ace, Sabo said as he walked to the door with his brothers. Luffy was snug in the middle as always, nervous energy building in him as they walked. He did like the pirates, so it would be too bad if they really were turning on them right now. Then tell these things to stop happening. Ace countered as they walked out. Sabo didn't bother responding to that as they made their way through the hull and to the deck. To get to the room Whitebeard was in, they had to cross the deck and go into the door on the other side, but right in that path, Teach stood, talking to someone. They definitely didn't want to go near the man, but they didn't have much choice. Huddling together they walked briskly, trying to keep anyone from stopping them, especially Teach. However, right as they passed him, Teach stopped talking to his friend and turned their way. Hey, you three are the new kids, right? Teach asked. It seemed pleasant enough, he was smiling politely and gave off a peaceful air, but knowing what was going on in that man's head, they shivered. The peaceful vibe became a threatening aura, the polite smile was much more menacing, and the pleasantness of his voice was more hostile. However, Sabo put on a polite face as well, ignoring the warning bells in his head, telling him to take his brothers and run. We are, Sabo said simply, not wanting to elaborate any further. Well, it's nice to finally meet you. Name's Teach. Teach said, holding out a hand. Sabo looked at the hand, knowing that the man was looking for a handshake, but couldn't quite bring himself to raise his own to meet him. Don't. Ace's simple tap was easy to catch, but Sabo couldn't just not shake the man's hand. If the pirates actually weren't turning on them, it wouldn't be good to make enemies with a man who was already dangerous to them. So, swallowing his fear and anxiety, Sabo raised his hand, gripping Teach's hand in his with a tense smile. Likewise, Sabo said curtly as they shook. The millisecond that it took felt like an hour as the two stared at each other, but finally, his hand was released and the brothers were turning on their heels, speed walking as fast as they could away from the man with the darkness. I need to wash my hand in acid, Sabo muttered with a scowl. He could almost feel the uncleanliness of the man on his hand. Ace looked at the blonde's hand with a sneer. Told you not to touch him. Ace replied. Luffy remained silent, glancing at Sabo's hand as well, practically feeling the darkness taking residence on his brother's hand. The brothers reached the door that would take them to Whitebeard quickly after that and sighed in relief. After having to talk with Teach, anything would be better than that, even the pirates turning on them. Ready? Sabo asked, raising a hand to hold the doorknob of the meeting room. Ace and Luffy nodded, giving Sabo the okay he needed to open the door. Whitebeard and Marco were the only two in the room, the captain sitting at the head with Marco in the chair right at his side. It made the three feel a bit more at ease, knowing that all they had to do was get a snail phone away from these two, and then book it, rather than have to fight an entire room of commanders. Still, it was the two strongest people on the ship in a single room. Hello, boys. Whitebeard greeted as the brothers sat at the opposite end of the table. Good afternoon, Whitebeard, Sabo replied as he sat down. We heard you wanted to speak with us. Sabo continued as he watched the captain carefully, ready for anything. Luffy, if this does turn into a fight, don't hide your powers. Use them to grab a snail phone so we can leave. Sabo tapped as he saw the snail phones all at the end of the table where Whitebeard was at. Luffy tapped, telling Sabo that he understood. I did. I was actually wondering something. Whitebeard said, confusing the brothers a bit. What is it? Sabo asked a bit cautiously. He didn't know what the captain could be wondering. Was it the facility? That would be the safest option to assume. He could see Ace's leg bouncing in anticipation, his fists clenching and unclenching in his lap. Well, I was wondering if you three would like to join my crew. Become my sons. Whitebeard announced, his voice sounding almost too loud in the small quiet room. Anything that the brothers could have been imagining suddenly crashed around them at the captain's exclamation. Everything they had thought was going to happen, everything they expected to be said, none of this was it. He wants us to join, Ace asked in shock, legs ceasing its incessant bouncing, hands unclenched in his lap. Sabo couldn't even think up a response as he sat in a much similar state of shock. His eyes were as white as Ace's, and he was just barely able to keep his jaw from hanging. Luffy, for the most part, was unaffected by the question. He understood what the captain was asking, but he wasn't sure why he was asking it. Didn't they make him mad with all the tests that Sabo thought of? Why would he want them to stay? Looking over at his brothers, he realized they weren't going to answer anytime soon, and Luffy didn't need his powers to tell him they were in shock. Why? Luffy speaking snapped his brothers out of it, both of them looking between Whitebeard and Luffy, wondering what the response would be. I like you three, Whitebeard said simply as if that explained it all. Luffy? Ace needed confirmation that the man was being genuine in his words. He couldn't believe that after 3 weeks with the brothers the man liked them. He knew nothing about them. He means it. Luffy affirmed as he felt the genuine nature roll easily off the captain. Or? Sabo asked because he was having the same doubts as Ace. Still blue. No gray. Marco too. Luffy reported. Ace and Sabo shared a look, wondering what their next steps should be. How can you like us when you don't know anything about us? Sabo asked in an even tone, still unsure about the entire thing. Whitebeard chuckled. But I do know about you. I know you have big appetites, I know you all are brothers, I know you would do anything to keep each other safe, and I know all three of you are good people. What more do I need to know? Whitebeard asked, astounding Ace and Sabo some more, while Luffy merely sat back and listened. But that doesn't mean anything. What if we aren't as good as you think? Ace asked, thinking back to all the horrible things the doctors at the facility made them do. Whitebeard shrugged. I don't. And I won't. Not unless you tell or show me, but as I know you now, I don't believe that could be possible. Whitebeard said in a confident tone. What if we become more trouble than we're worth? We've already got Marines after us, and you don't even know what happened back at the facility. Sabo added. We're pirates, Marines are already after us, what's a few more? As for the facility, it's true, I don't know what happened there, and I don't expect to know unless you want to tell me about it, but that's your past, it doesn't define who you are now. Whatever happened there has nothing to do with the person you are now. Whitebeard said, and it amazed Luffy how genuine someone could feel when they were talking. It was like the warmth, he had never felt so much of it come from one person. But it does. We are who we are because we had to be it. We aren't who we were when we went into that place, and we never will be again. Ace said angrily, fists clenched again as he fumed. Luffy frowned at the feelings coming from his brother, and hated the facility even more for making him feel that way. Meanwhile, Sabo watched him in shock, not having expected that outburst from the eldest. And is it a bad thing? Marco suddenly asked, the brothers nearly forgetting he was there. What? Ace asked, confused by the question. Is it a bad thing that you've become the person you are now? Marco elaborated. Ace went silent as he thought the question over. When he didn't respond for a minute, Whitebeard spoke. I'm sure whatever you three went through back at the facility was horrible, and I don't expect you becoming my sons to change that. I know things are difficult for you three, and that you'll have lasting scars, but that doesn't need to keep you back from moving forward. I want you as my sons because I like you, and I want to help you. You don't need to accept if you don't want to, but I wanted to extend the offer anyways. Whitebeard explained calmly. Silence reigned over the room once more as the brothers thought over the captain's words. They still didn't know how to feel about the whole situation, especially because, just moments ago, they had been testing the pirates on whether they were actually good people or not. If you don't mind, I think we need some time to think this over, Sabo said a bit hesitantly. Whitebeard nodded. Of course, take as much time as you need, he said, the brothers standing from their seats. Thank you, Whitebeard, Marco. We'll see you later, Sabo said as they walked to the door, leaving. They made the walk back to their room much quicker than they had made the walk to the meeting room. It helped that they weren't stopped this time. Chapter 47. Adventures on Sabati. It had been another sleepless night for the brothers as they mulled over what answer they should give to Whitebeard. On one hand, they already stayed on the ship and hung around everyone. Joining wouldn't be much more different than how things already were. On the other hand, joining would mean that they would have to answer to Whitebeard as a captain. Also, if the brothers wanted to leave, it wouldn't be as easy as it would if they didn't join. Ace, for once, was unsure about what to do. He didn't feel strongly toward one side or another, and that actually shocked Sabo and Luffy more than Whitebeard's offer had. It's only because you've been trying to convince me they're good people. Ace defended indignantly, arms crossed as he looked away from his brother's suspicious gazes. After having slept on it, albeit it having only been a few hours of sleep, the brothers were still just as far away from an answer as they had been yesterday. Maybe if we eat then we'll know. Luffy suggested, his stomach growling as he smelled breakfast. Sabo sighed but smiled at Luffy's antics. Breakfast is done now, so we may as well go and eat, Sabo said with a shrug. Ace was silent, but nodded his agreement, following his brothers out the door. They didn't know if Whitebeard had talked to everyone else about the fact that he wants the brothers to join, but not knowing made every pair of eyes that much more overbearing. They knew Whitebeard had told them they could take their time in thinking over their decision, but how long was he willing to wait? When they got to the galley and got their food, they ate it silently and quickly. Right as they stood to leave though, Aizo stopped them. Don't forget your wristbands today. The brothers were a bit confused as to what that meant, but Aizo continued. We should be landing at Sabati today. I was just saying that you should remember those wristbands I made you if you wanted to walk around. Aizo elaborated. Oh, thank you Aizo, we'll be sure to wear them then, Sabo said, completely forgetting that they were supposed to be landing today. Sabo said their goodbyes and the brothers headed straight to their room. Sabati's the place Thatch was talking about, right? The one with the marine base. Ace asked as Sabo took out their wristbands that he had put in the desk drawer. The blonde nodded, handing Luffy and Ace their bands while slipping his over his wrist. It was surprisingly comfortable. It is. That means we should probably stick around the pirates or even the ship. We don't want to risk wandering over to it, Sabo said, shutting the drawer and sitting in the chair. We can't go exploring then? Luffy asked sadly, already pouting. Sabo sighed. We can't, Lu, sorry. Maybe next time, when we know it'll be safer to explore, Sabo said. Luffy nodded, still obviously upset, but accepting his brother's words. In the meanwhile, we should probably discuss Whitebeard's offer more, Sabo said, leaning back in the desk chair and staring at the ceiling. We don't want to leave, so joining is the best option, but we also don't want to be restricted because we joined. Ace summed up as he lay down in bed, Luffy curling up beside him. Sabo nodded with another sigh. We also know that, so far, they've passed all of our tests. I don't know, maybe these pirates really are nice and just want to help us, Sabo said, conflicted. Ace frowned at that. I don't know, what if they just want us to feel that way so they can learn about what happened in the facility? What if, when they find out, they don't want us here anymore? Ace asked, Luffy curling up closer at the mention of the facility again. The only way to know for sure would be to tell them and see what they do. There isn't really a test we could do to figure out how they would react to information like that, Sabo said in frustration, wishing things could just be easier for them. After everything the world had thrown at them, why couldn't things just be easy now? They should be, Ace muttered dryly, and suddenly, Sabo had an idea, one he knew Ace definitely would not like by any stretch of the imagination. Actually, I think there is, Sabo said a bit hesitantly, regretting the words as fast as he spoke them. Ace and Luffy sat up, both looking at Sabo in confusion. Ace, because he wanted to know what Sabo's idea was, but Luffy, because he could feel the apprehension and worry coming from Sabo from the idea. What is it? Ace asked. Sabo bit his lip, looking away from his brothers. You're not going to like it, he said, hoping Ace would drop it after that, knowing he shouldn't have mentioned it in the first place. So what? I haven't liked half of your plans, but we still did them, Ace said with a scoff. Yeah, well, this isn't like my other plans, Sabo admitted, only making his brothers more curious. You can't just bring it up and not tell us, come on. Ace pushed. Sabo sighed again, this time in defeat. I warned you. The only way we can know how they'll react to having such sensitive information about us is if we tell them something equally sensitive, Sabo began. Ace raised an eyebrow at this, waiting for Sabo to continue. And I was thinking that the only other information we've got that's that important would be your father, Sabo said, not even daring to speak his name. As expected, Ace immediately grew angry, scowling and making fists. Nope. No way. Ace said immediately, not even allowing himself to think about the idea. And this is why I didn't want to tell you. That's the only thing we could do to figure out how they would react to the facility, Sabo said. The conversation was cut short when Sabo heard that they were docking. Telling his brothers as much, they all got up and headed to the deck where they stood by the railing, out of everyone's way. They watched people get ready, heard the captain give orders, and watched people walk off the ship with smiles and coins. Alright you three, let's go touring. Thatch spoke up behind them. Turning, they saw the chef heading their way, holding out 3 bags for them to take, presumably filled with money. Thanking the chef, they each took a bag, Sabo taking Luffy's, and followed the man off the ship. You're our tour guide today, Sabo asked lightly, noticing that Thatch seemed extremely happy. That's right. Good old Thatch'll show you all the hot spots here, Sabati. All while avoiding those pesky marines. Thatch announced. Luffy decided that he liked Thatch a lot, and it wasn't just because the man was radiating good emotions either. He hadn't forgotten that Thatch was one of the first people he had met, and not only that, but he was someone who kept promises and made food, which were all bonuses in Luffy's eyes. Yeah, Thatch was a good guy. Where to first then, Mr. Tour Guide? Sabo asked as he and his brothers looked around, noticing the tall mangroves and the bubbles floating up from the ground. Well, I think the most logical place to start would be groves 40 to 49, the tourist section. Thatch exclaimed as he headed, presumably, to those groves. The trio followed, watching with wonder as bubbles formed out of the ground, floating high into the sky to the point that they couldn't even see them, save for Ace and his supervision, before popping. Anything you want, I bet you'll find it here. Thatch said, gesturing his arms out wide, showing off the giant selection of stalls surrounding them. Whoa. So much stuff. Luffy exclaimed, ready to run off, but knowing he couldn't. That's right. Why don't we go look around for a bit? As long as you can pay for it with what's in your pouches, you can get it. Thatch said, gesturing to their pouches of money they had been given. You mean like a hat for Ace? And Sabo too? Luffy asked, confusing Thatch a bit, however, the chef nodded. Yeah, even hats. Why do you ask? Thatch asked as Luffy practically began dragging his brothers off to the many stalls, looking specifically for one selling hats. Because Ace needs a hat like me and Sabo's. And Sabo lost his hat a long time ago, so he needs a new one. Luffy set a determined look on his face as he scanned the stalls around him. Ace and Sabo were a bit surprised that Luffy remembered the fact that he wanted to get them hats, seeing as he had mentioned it so long ago. Ah, I guess that makes sense. What about that one? The chef asked, pointing to a stall that was, indeed, selling a wide variety of hats. Luffy beamed, already dragging the group that way, careful not to stretch his arms too far. Perfect. He said happily as they walked up to the cheery-looking vendor. Hello there and welcome to Humphrey's Hats. Any hat you could ever want or need can be found right here. The man, presumably Humphrey, said cheerfully. Sabo smiled to the man seeing as Luffy was already knee-deep in hats. The stall was a standard size with hats lining the shelves behind Humphrey, as well as a few racks in front of the counter that Luffy was perusing through, picking up and inspecting hats before dropping them to the floor and moving on to the next. This left Ace and Sabo with the task of catching and returning the hats to their proper place before continuing. Thatch, however, was right by Luffy's side, helping him pull off hats and showing them off to the youngest, sometimes even placing the hats on Ace and Sabo's head, so he and Luffy could see what they looked like. What about this one? Thatch asked, holding up a very gesture-esque hat, to which Luffy shook his head with furrowed brows. No, maybe something more like this. He said, holding up a very bright red hat that almost looked like a mariachi hat with two black tassels hanging off of it. Thatch nodded, seemingly in understanding, as he continued his search. Who do you think he wants that hat to be for? Ace asked as he caught the red hat before it hit the ground, turning it over with a grimace. Sabo smiled wickedly at him, making him frown. If I know Luffy, probably you. Sabo said, catching a baby blue ball cap. What's that supposed to mean? Ace asked, catching a pea green knitted cap. It means that he's most likely going to find me a hat like the one I already had, whereas he's finding you a completely new one. That one looked nothing like my top hat. Sabo said, pointing back to the red one, simultaneously catching a brown fedora. Ace pouted but didn't say anything more. This one? No, more colorful. This one? No, too tall. This one? No, too glittery. Ace was thankful that Luffy didn't like the glitter bomb of a hat that Thatch had suggested. The pair continued searching with Luffy giving his criticisms as they went, and soon they were running out of hats to look at. What about this one? Luffy shouted happily as he held up a bright orange cowboy hat with two similarly orange tassels dangling down, connected by a wooden circle with a skull on it. Luffy grinned proudly as he bounced over to Ace, placing the hat down on his head. See? It's perfect. Luffy said happily as he stood back and admired his achievement. Ha, it actually does suit him, Sabo said, slightly amazed. You're right Luffy, it looks pretty good. Thatch said, a pleased smile on his face as he took in the hat. Ace didn't know how he felt about all the attention, especially when he couldn't see what the hat looked like on him. Before he could snap though, Thatch spoke up again. I guess it's too bad we couldn't find something for Sabo here though. He said, walking up to the counter with Luffy. What are you talking about? That one's Sabo's. Luffy said, pointing to a navy blue, almost black top hat sitting on the shelf behind the vendor. Told you so, Sabo whispered to Ace who hit Sabo's shoulder with a glare. Whatever. Ace muttered as he walked up to the counter as well. Can we have that hat? Please. Luffy asked, saying the please almost as an afterthought, but beaming as he felt pride come from Sabo and felt a ruffle of his hair from Ace. Right away. Humphrey said jovially, turning and grabbing the hat and handing it over to Luffy, who placed it on Sabo's head. See? Perfect. It's just like your old one. Luffy said. Here, this'll help, Barney said, pulling out a tiny mirror that they could hold. Ace took it first, looking over the orange cowboy hat, and finding that he didn't hate it as much as he thought he would. Passing the mirror to Sabo, the blonde had a much similar reaction, though he hadn't expected to hate it much at all. After all, it was very similar to his old hat. Bid picks Luffy. How much for the both of them? Sabo asked. After getting a price, Sabo pulled the amount out of Luffy's pouch, handing over the money and thanking the man as they left. Alright, anything else you three are looking for? Thatch asked, his hands behind his head as he walked casually along. Accessories. Luffy announced, confusing them all once again. Accessories. Ace, Sabo, and Thatch all asked in unison. Luffy merely nodded, seeming to spot whatever stall he was thinking of and walking that way. Welcome to Abigail's Accessories. How may I help you? Abigail asked with a cheery smile. We're just looking, Sabo replied politely as Luffy gazed at the many necklaces, glasses, bags, pins, and more. Like the last stall, some were on shelves behind the vendor, some were on cases in the counter, and there was a small shelving unit in front of the stall with even more thing on it. Luffy looked through all the cases, all the shelves, looking for whatever it was he was after, and after looking into one of the cases, his pensive look turned into another smile. This one? Luffy said, pointing inside the case. Abigail bent over the counter to see what Luffy was looking at, and once she recognized it, she smiled. Ah, yes, the beaded twins. Good choice, she said, Luffy picking the case up and putting it on the counter. And those two? He said as he peered around the woman to a pair of goggles. She nodded and grabbed the item, bringing it back to the counter with her. The beaded twins come with this necklace for free if you want it, Abigail said as she pulled out another item, a red beaded necklace. Luffy nodded happily, turning to Sabo expectantly who sighed, walking up and pulling out the necessary amount of money, while Luffy happily scooped up his newly purchased items. So, what are those for Luffy? Thatch asked, confused as to why Luffy had purchased such seemingly random items. They're accessories. For Ace and Sabo's hats. They look boring without them. Luffy said, pulling Ace a bit lower so he could place the beaded twins on his hat. It was a similarly red beaded band with a smiley face and frowny face at the front that fit perfectly around Ace's hat. Luffy also put the necklace around Ace's neck before moving on to Sabo and doing the same to him, placing the goggles on his hat. They look splendid, Abigail said, clasping her hands from where she watched. Luffy beamed proudly at his purchases while Ace and Sabo looked at each other. Ha, those look familiar. It's like you never lost your old hat, Sabo. Ace said, admiring how similar to the old one Sabo's new goggles and hat looked. Can't say the same for you, Ace. You never had a hat, but you don't look too bad either. Sabo agreed, taking Ace's previous statement as a compliment. The joblu, Ace and Sabo said, patting Luffy's shoulders as Luffy continued beaming proudly. After that the group walked through more stalls, getting some food and other tiny trinkets. Luffy was set on buying a telescope that one of the vendors was selling, and Ace and Sabo decided to split the price, seeing as Luffy had gotten them stuff already. Now I can see like Ace, Luffy had exclaimed, looking through the scope happily as he spun around, looking at different things. Do you normally have bad eyesight? Thatch asked, confused as to what Luffy meant. No, Ace just has really good eyesight is all. He can see way better than Luffy and I. Sabo said a bit nervously. Noticing that he had slipped up, Luffy quickly apologized with taps, which the brothers responded to with a, "It's fine, but be more careful." With this new knowledge, Thatch had begun testing Ace on how far he could see. What's that say? Thatch asked, pointing to a sign that the group wasn't close enough to actually read yet. His is his pizza, Ace said, seeing the sign clear as day. What about that one? Thatch asked joyfully, pointing to another sign. Freddy's fashion show. This was almost too easy for him. That one? Thatch asked, but it was just a bit too far for Ace to be comfortable with reading out loud. Normal people definitely couldn't see that far. Don't know, he said, ignoring the fact that he actually did know and would be keeping Luffy far away from Rory's all-you-can-eat. Man, we should have you do watch, no one would be able to sneak up on us, Thatch said with a laugh. Ace and Sabo smiled along while Luffy continued window shopping happily, enjoying all the happy feelings surrounding them. It was nice for the brothers to not have to worry about Marines noticing their numbers. It was like they were in a disguise, one that no one would notice unless their wristbands were removed. Even though the threat of Marines was still there, they were still relatively safe. Why don't we head to the amusement park now for a bit till we have to go back to the ship? Thatch asked, garnering cheers from Luffy. They were led to the giant park where they stared in amazement at all of the rides and attractions. It wasn't too long after that they were all getting on ride after ride, the sun beginning to set as they did. Alright, last one everyone, the Ferris wheel, Thatch exclaimed, gesturing to the giant wheel. The brothers, who had been smiling happily the entire time, nodded in excitement as they waited in line. The booths had 2 seats on either side, so Ace and Thatch sat on one side, while Sabo and Luffy sat on the other. The bubble over the top gave the group a view of the sky, while also keeping them from falling out, which was a legitimate worry when Luffy was involved. Wow, look, Sabo, we're so high. Ace, look at that. We got your hats there. Hey, I didn't know there was an all-you-can-eat place. We should go there. All in all, the day had been a good one, probably one of the best days of their lives, save for the day that they escaped the facility. Well, I guess it's time to head back to the Moby. Thatch said with a yawn after they exited the Ferris wheel. The brothers nodded in agreement, Ace stretching while Sabo and Luffy yawned as well. The walk back was quiet, except for the constant chatter from those around them, still having fun and buying souvenirs. They had just gotten back to Groves 40 to 49 when Thatch and Luffy both frowned. A slight shiver ran through Luffy, and Ace and Sabo already had an idea as to why. Before they could begin any tapping or questioning though, Thatch pulled them into an alley behind some stalls and shops, hiding them all from view of the street. What's happening? Ace asked in a whisper, peeking out carefully as he asked. Thatch and Sabo peeked out as well, along with Luffy, though he did it much more hesitantly than the other. Darkness. Lots and lots of darkness. More than Teach and Hair. 3 people. Luffy tapped out quickly, making Ace and Sabo pale in fear. Thatch, however, didn't notice. Instead, he was glaring at the group of people heading their way down the street. Celestial dragons. Thatch spat out, the brothers watching as people began bowing, looking at the ground. The once happy and joyful feelings that had been surrounding Luffy turned to ones of fear and darkness, and Luffy hated every second of it. He only caught a glimpse of the 3 with the darkness, before he had to sit down behind this stall they were hiding behind. He could barely handle this much darkness getting this close. All 3 of the people had darkness worse than Teach and Hair combined, and with 3 people having that much, it was a massive cloud heading their way that was starting to suffocate him. There was no warmth coming from Whitebeard to balance the darkness. He didn't even know if Whitebeard could make enough warmth to make a dent in it. He vaguely felt a hand on his shoulder, could barely register the fact that there was a different feeling other than darkness by him, but the darkness was too strong for him to make out what it could possibly be. The cloud rolled over him now, blanketing him in the slimy, suffocating feeling, making him close his eyes as he attempted to catch his breath. In what seemed like hours, the cloud finally rolled past him and continued on, much to Luffy's relief as he gulped in the clean, fresh air. You alright, Luffy? Ace asked beside him, rubbing his back. Luffy nodded, noticing that he had been sweating and trembling. Can you walk? Sabo asked, worry on his face. Luffy honestly didn't know, but the second he tried to stand he fell back down. No? His voice was quiet and timid, barely getting the word out. There wasn't a second's hesitation as Ace hoisted Luffy up onto his back, Sabo helping make sure he was secure before they left the safety of the alley. Do you want me to call the nurses? Thatch asked a bit hesitantly. He knew of the brothers' dislike of nurses, but whatever Luffy had gone through back there looked serious. Sabo roughly shook his head. No, he'll be fine, don't worry, Sabo said tensely, still frowning. Thatch felt a bit conflicted, but nodded, deciding it would do more harm to call them right now. He would talk to Pops about it when they got back and see what the captain thought was best. Well, are you feeling better, Luffy? Thatch asked, hoping to see the bright, happy teen he had seen all day. Luffy, however, did not look like that now. He looked tired, pale, and sweaty as he clung to Ace. Don't worry, I'm fine. Luffy mumbled, not enjoying the worry and nervousness coming from the chef. It was better when he felt happy, warm feelings, not ones that made him want to worry and be nervous too. A hand on his back and pulses of warmth from his brothers calmed him down, before any more of the worry from the chef could affect him. Apparently, he was much more susceptible to feeling other people's feelings when he was this tired. Good to know. Which reminded him, he never told Ace and Sabo about the fact that he could feel people using Haki. Well, that would have to wait. When they were back at the Moby, they avoided questions of whether Luffy was okay or not with answers that he was fine and just tired. When the brothers finally made it to their room, Ace deposited Luffy onto their bed, while Sabo put the telescope on the desk, along with his and Ace's hats. What happened back there, Lou? Sabo asked gently as he moved to sit on the bed. Luffy shrugged, curling into a ball on his side, facing the brothers. Lots of darkness. I couldn't breathe, and it got dark. Luffy said with a shiver, still feeling a bit icky from how much darkness had passed over him. It's over now, that's all that matters. We'll just have to make celestial dragons one of the people we stay far away from. Ace said with a sneer as he mentioned the name of those bastards. Sabo and Thatch had briefed him on what a celestial dragon was, even going as far as to mention the slaves they kept, and Ace couldn't figure out if he hated them more than the doctors at the facility or not. Thatch is coming, Sabo said, getting up and heading to the door. He brought something yummy, Luffy said with a small smile. Sabo chuckled a bit at that, opening the door after the first knock and greeting the chef with a smile. Hi, there Thatch, what's up? Sabo asked casually, finding no need to use politeness when he was still strained from Luffy's panic attack. If that's even what it could be called. Well, I brought this for Luffy. I thought it might help him feel a little better. Thatch said, holding a large glass full of a pink liquid. "It's a smoothie I made, has lots of fruits and things." Thatch explained a bit quickly as he handed the glass over to Sabo, who took it with a smile. "Thank you, Thatch, I'm sure he'll love it. Good night," Sabo said, Thatch, saying a quick goodnight and calling out a feel better to Luffy as the door shut. "That was nice of him," Sabo said as he looked at the smoothie, walking over to the bed where Ace helped Luffy sit up. I like Thatch, he's a good guy," Luffy said, happily taking the smoothie from Sabo, using the straw to drink it as fast as possible. "Slow down a little, Lou. Is he Marco and Whitebeard good, or just good?" Ace asked as he made Luffy slow down a bit in drinking. The youngest seemed to think about it for a minute, Ace and Sabo waiting patiently for a response. He keeps promises, and he hid us from the darkness, and he helped us escape, and he makes good food, and his color's still blue, so I think he's a good guy. Like Marco and Mr. Whitebeard," Luffy determined, returning to sipping his drink happily. Ace and Sabo took in this new information, knowing now that Thatch was someone that they could be around without worry. "Oh yeah, I forgot to tell you guys, but I can feel when someone uses hockey," Luffy suddenly exclaimed as he finished his smoothie. "Huh?" Ace and Sabo asked, shocked and confused. "When I got lost and Marco was bringing me back to you, I felt him use his hockey so that he could find you," Luffy explained. "That's new. Did you ever feel that before?" Sabo asked. "I don't think so," Luffy said, trying to remember if he had felt mystery feelings coming from anyone. "We haven't been around much hockey, to begin with though," Ace said with a shrug. "That's true, we never really needed to use it, huh?" Sabo said as he thought back to their time in the facility. The times they had used it hadn't exactly been good times for Luffy to focus on someone's feelings either. "Well, it's good you figured that out, Luffy, it could become helpful later. Why don't we go to bed now though? It's been a long day," Sabo said, taking the empty glass from Luffy and putting it on their desk. His brothers agreed and all of them got comfy. "What happened out there, son?" Whitebeard asked, having seen how Luffy looked when he had come back to the ship, carried by Ace. "I don't really know, Aoji. One second he was fine, the next he was I don't know, panicking," Thatch said, a bit unsure. "Tell us what was happening before that, Yoi," Marco suggested. The commanders and captain were sitting in the meeting room, whiskey as well, as Thatch gave a retelling of whatever had happened on Sabati. "Okay, well, we had just finished at the amusement park, the brothers seemed happy and stuff, and since it was getting dark we decided to head back here." Thatch began, trying to remember exactly what had happened. "And then when we got to the tourist section one noticed that there was a group of celestial dragons coming," Thatch continued with a scowl. "None of them liked the dragons, so there was a similar reaction among the commanders. So I took them to a nearby alley so we didn't get spotted by them. One second we're peeking out at them, the next Luffy's sitting against the wall and can barely breathe. Ace and Sabo were trying to calm him down, but when it didn't do anything they just went silent and waited. Ace asked who the dragons were and Sabo and I explained them to him, and once they were gone, Luffy was fine." Thatch finished, still worried for the boy. "What were his symptoms?" Whiskey asked, thinking maybe if she couldn't see the boys themselves, she could figure out a way to help without having to actually talk to them. "Symptoms? Well, he was shaking a lot, looked like he couldn't breathe, pale, sweating, didn't look like he could hear us either," Thatch said, thinking back to how Luffy had acted. Whiskey frowned as she thought. "It sounds like he could have had a panic attack. A major one at that," Whiskey said, a bit more to herself than to others. "A panic attack?" Harita asked, not having been expecting that answer. "By the sounds of it, yes," Whiskey affirmed. "What caused it though?" "The celestial dragons," King Du asked. "It's possible, however, Ace didn't know who the dragons were," Whiskey said as they all tried to figure out what had triggered the attack. "But Sabo knew about them. You said he explained what they were to Ace with you, right?" Fasa asked. Thatch nodded. "Even if that were the case, wouldn't they all know who they were, not just Sabo and maybe Luffy?" Curiel asked. "What else could it have been though?" Jozu asked. "Panic attacks can be triggered by anything. It's possible that it had nothing to do with the dragons, and Luffy simply saw something familiar in the background that caused it. We wouldn't know unless they tell us," Whiskey said with a sigh. "Is there anything we can do to help him?" Izo asked. "For now, I think we should just give them some space." Thatch brought over a smoothie which should help get something in his stomach at least. Whiskey said with a sigh, none of them liking that they couldn't do anything. "Why don't we all go get some much needed rest then? Tomorrow we can keep an eye on the brothers and make sure they're okay," Whitebeard suggested, everyone reluctantly nodding as they began standing and leaving the room. They would just have to take things one step at a time. Chapter 48. Next stop, Fishman Island. The next morning the brothers all woke up feeling well rested, which was a nice change for them. Once they were a bit more awake, Luffy started to look around in confusion. "What's wrong, Lou?" Ace asked as he and Sabo put on their new hats. "Teacher's gone," Luffy said in confusion, eyebrows scrunched together. "Gone? What do you mean gone?" Ace asked a bit frantically. "He's not on the ship anymore," Luffy said, head tilted now as he determined this. Calm down guys, maybe he's on the island. Besides, it's better for us when he's not here. Sabo said with a sigh, understanding why this could worry the two, but seeing no use in worrying about it right now. And don't forget, we still have to give an answer to Whitebeard on whether we're joining or not, Sabo added as they all got ready for the day. But we still don't know, Luffy said, knowing that this was going to be a difficult choice for them. Exactly, which is why. Tell them about you-know-who. Ace said suddenly, shocking both Ace and Luffy. But Ace, that's your secret. Luffy said in a whispered shout, knowing how much that secret meant to his brother. Yeah, well it doesn't matter anyway. The Marines are already after us, so if they find out about it then whatever. Ace said, trying to play off the seriousness of the situation, but knowing he wasn't fooling anyone. Ace, hold on, we can think of something else. I told you already, that was a stupid plan I should have never mentioned, Sabo said, trying to deter his brother from giving away something he held so close to him. No, you were right before Sabo, there's no way to know how they'll react to the facility without telling them something equally important, Ace said. Sabo's eyes narrowed. Why are you so ready to tell them now? Yesterday you were quite adamant we keep that a secret. It wasn't even up for negotiation. Sabo said, crossing his arms accusatorily. Ace frowned, also crossing his arms as he looked away. Yeah, well, a lot of stuff happened yesterday. I was just thinking that maybe these guys can be nice. Thatch kept us hidden from those dragon people, and he didn't try anything when Luffy had an attack. We've also tested random pirates, and they were good too, so maybe these people would be okay to join. Ace said, and it sounded like the words he was saying were extremely reluctant. Sabo and Luffy knew that Ace must have thought a lot about this before bringing it up. And you're sure this is what you want to do? Ace, once we tell them, there's no taking it back. Sabo said in worry, not wanting him to make any rash decisions. I'm sure Sabo. Like I said, the Marines are already after me, so even if they go and rat on me, it won't be much different than it is now. Ace said, once again trying to be nonchalant about the whole thing. Sabo sighed, shaking his head as he noticed this. That's not what makes this a big deal and you know it, Sabo said because it was true. Ace could care less if Marines went after him, it was the fact that he would be associated with Roger that made him want to keep it a secret in the first place. It doesn't matter, Ace muttered, wanting to be off this subject now. Luffy watched silently, taking in the different emotions coming from his brothers. It had been a long time since Luffy had felt Ace feel nervous, not because of an outside force, but because of himself. Normally, whenever Ace was nervous it was because of a new test, or because Luffy was in trouble, but not because he was doing something himself to be nervous about. If we're doing this, then we need to all be sure about the pirates. There hasn't been any gray. Sabo asked Luffy, going over the good person checklist. Luffy shook his head. Nope. Only blue. Luffy reported happily, all of them ignoring the fact that Teach most definitely was not blue. And they did manage to pass all the tests. No one's gotten any weird vibes. Ace, you didn't see anyone doing anything suspicious? Sabo asked. It was another no from the eldest as he thought back to everything he'd seen aboard the Moby. I haven't heard anything either. We can tell Whitebeard and Marco after breakfast if you're sure. If they don't attack us right away then I think we should wait until we've been here a month to make sure they don't go and tell any Marines. Sabo reasoned, Ace and Luffy nodding their agreement to yet another plan. It seemed the whole brothers' lives revolved around planning. With all of that said and done the brothers headed off to breakfast where everyone was already chowing down. It was relieving for the brothers to not have to worry about Teach in the meanwhile, but also a bit unnerving seeing as they didn't know where he was or when he would pop back up. The three ate in silence per usual, Sabo listening in on conversations, and finding out Marco had begun getting suspicious about the betting going on around Thatch's fishing poles. Haruta seemed more than a bit bummed out that his game was cut off preemptively. When the brothers were finishing Sabo decided now was the time to speak up. Turning to the captain he put on another polite smile. We were wondering if we could talk to you and Marco after you were finished Whitebeard. Sabo requested, some of the commanders looking a bit shocked or confused, whereas Whitebeard and Marco merely looked to expect this, which they should have. Of course, Whitebeard said, the brothers nodding as they began to leave. They didn't have to wait long, and soon Whitebeard, Marco, and the brothers were once again in the same meeting room as before, sitting in the same spots. Have you come to a decision? Whitebeard asked. Not quite. But we did have something we wanted to tell you just so you know a little more about who you'd be taking aboard your crew. Sabo said, his words coming out a bit slow as he waited for Ace to interrupt, should he decide that he'd rather keep his secret. The eldest, however, remained completely silent. His leg was bouncing again in anticipation, and his arms were crossed as he stared at the wooden table they were sat at. Oh? What is it? Whitebeard asked. When Ace still didn't say anything to stop the information from coming out, Sabo sighed, ready to tell. What would you think if Roger had a son? You know Gold Roger? Ace suddenly asked instead, and Sabo had to keep from saying anything. They were, after all, about to tell them that his son was right there. Not seeming to be expecting the question both Marco and Whitebeard raised an eyebrow. I don't think it should matter. His son is his own person, and in the end, we're all children of the sea. Whitebeard said casually, shocking the brothers. Every time Ace had asked the questions he had been met with laughs, people saying his son was a demon and should die like his father had, but no one had ever said that, it didn't matter. Sabo, who had witnessed Ace ask this question a few times and had seen the responses to it, was also amazed by the response. Luffy was making sure to pay attention to the feelings coming from the two pirates, and when no anger or hate came up in response to Ace's questions he was surprised as well. Why do you ask? Marco asked, breaking the brothers out of their shock. Well, Sabo cleared his throat again, waiting for Ace to stop him. I'm his son. Ace said bitterly, a scowl on his face. The eldest began watching the two carefully, waiting for their response, while Sabo and Luffy tensed, ready to fight for their brother if necessary. Is that all? Whitebeard asked, only proving to throw the brothers into shock again. Is that all? What's that supposed to mean? I'm the old pirate king's son, your old rival's son. Ace explained as if the two pirates didn't know who Goldie Roger was. Whitebeard, who was still smiling, merely shrugged. We may have been rivals, and he may have been the pirate king, but as I said before, you're your own person, Whitebeard repeated, and Luffy could feel that Whitebeard genuinely meant his words, telling his brothers as much. It was quiet now as the brothers got over their shock, but eventually, that silence was broken by Marco. That would mean you three aren't blood related then? Marco asked, picking up on the way Ace had specifically said Roger was his father, neglecting to say he was their father. Besides, Roger was a faithful man, and he hadn't exactly lived long enough to have children as young as Luffy. No, we're sworn brothers, we all have different parents, Sabo answered, still a bit shell-shocked. Whitebeard and Marco both nodded in understanding. Was that all you three wanted to talk about? Whitebeard asked, the brothers realizing that it was time to end the conversation now. Yes, it was. Thank you, Whitebeard, Marco, for taking the time to listen. Sabo thanked as he and his brothers stood. It was no problem, Whitebeard said as Ace and Luffy walked out the door. Sabo, though, paused in the doorway, turning around to face the pirates again. And about your offer, we'll have an answer by the end of the month, Sabo said, as if he had forgotten to mention it before. Whitebeard smiled and nodded. Don't worry about it, take all the time you need, the captain said with a wave. The blonde smiled, nodding to the pirates again, and left, closing the door behind him. Ace and Luffy were waiting for him a few feet away, having noticed that he wasn't following, and Sabo quickly caught up, the three heading back to the deck. Well, that went better than expected, Sabo said, still a bit stunned by the results of their confession to Whitebeard. Luffy grinned. I told you Mr. Whitebeard and Marco were good people, Luffy said matter-of-factly. We didn't think they weren't, it's just that, even good people can turn bad when they hear certain things, Sabo explained to Luffy who took the information in. But well, Whitebeard and Marco didn't, so they're the best good people, Luffy said. Ace rolled his eyes, knocking the boy's straw hat off and ruffling his hair. Yeah, for now at least. We still have to wait and see if they go and tell on us, Ace said, and even though he said it casually and looked calm, Sabo knew he was probably freaking out about this still. Luffy knew, for a fact, that Ace was freaking out though because he could feel it, the turmoil of feelings, the fear, the worry, the nervousness. The Raven tried to block the feelings and instead sidled up to Ace, giving him a hug that stopped both of them from walking. It'll be okay, Ace, they didn't turn grey, and they meant the words they said, and they weren't lying. I don't think they'll tell anyone, Luffy assured confidently. Sabo, who had stopped walking to watch his brothers, smiled, crossing his arms as he looked to Ace expectantly, waiting for his response. The eldest looked a bit flustered like he didn't know how to respond to Luffy's comforts, and truth be told, he probably didn't. You know we can't hide anything from him. I don't know why you even try, Sabo said with a shake of his head. Ace regained his composure, sending Sabo a defiant glare, though there was no heat behind it. Yeah, whatever. Thanks, Luffy, I feel better now, Ace said a bit reluctantly, hugging the youngest back for a second. Luffy released his hold, beaming at Ace as he felt all the bad feelings melt away, replaced with the warmth and love that Luffy was used to. Good. I don't like it when Ace or Sabo feel bad feelings, Luffy said, grin remaining as he began leading the way, leaving his two slightly dumbfounded brothers behind. They caught up quickly though, and the three reached the door that led to the deck. Opening it, Sabo took note of everyone in their vicinity, noticing that Whitebeard and Marco were finally leaving the meeting room, having been talking by themselves after the brothers left. Hey you guys, how was your chat with Pops and Marco? Thatch asked from where he was standing near the door. Sabo put on a smile as he addressed the chef. It went very well, Sabo said truthfully. Thatch grinned wider at those words. Well, that's good to hear. Hey, do you three want to head back out to the island today? It's our last day on Sabati seeing as the Mobi's almost fully coated now, Thatch explained. Sabo didn't even have to look at his brothers or wait for their input to know they wouldn't be going onto the island again anytime soon. No, I think we're just going to stay here for the day. If you wouldn't mind though, could you explain what coating is? You mentioned it before. Sabo said, having been curious since Thatch first brought it up in the infirmary when Ace was injured. Oh, yeah. The only way to get to Fishman Island is to sink to the bottom of the ocean, and the only way to do that is to get a coating on your ship. It's like a big bubble that surrounds the ship so that we can breathe and allows the ship to sink. Thatch explained to the best of his ability. Luffy looked amazed while Sabo looked thoughtful and Ace looked a bit unsure. That's interesting. I would have never thought something like that was possible. When are we leaving for Fishman Island? Sabo asked, noticing that Teach still wasn't anywhere near, from what he could hear. I think we're leaving close to dinner. Really, our ship coder has been working pretty hard to get us ready as fast as possible. Thatch said, glancing around for who Sabo assumed to be Rayleigh. Is there a reason you're rushing? Ace asked. After yesterday he was a bit more comfortable around Thatch and deemed the man worthy of conversation. Not really, but there have been a few rookies who thought they were big shots that have been messing around, and seeing as Fishman Island is under Pop's protection, we have to go stop them before they do anything too stupid. Thatch said with a bit of a chuckle. Anyways, since you three are staying on the ship today, why don't we do some fishing? I've been meaning to lately, but I've been a bit busy, what with the lack of chefs to help me in the kitchen with that sickness. Thatch said, reminding the three that Thatch had been working pretty hard lately, because most of the chefs had been out of commission. Are the chefs better? Luffy questioned, a bit concerned for them. Sabo and Ace didn't know if he was more worried about the people themselves, or the food that they couldn't make. They are, and to top it off, the rest of my division came back from their mission, so we've got more hands than usual. Thatch said happily, that happiness rubbing off on Luffy who suddenly became jittery with a good feeling. Come on Ace, come on Sabo, let's go fishing with Thatch. Luffy said, practically bouncing where he stood as he grabbed his brother's hands. The brothers recognized the sudden spike in Luffy's energy to possibly be from the chef's good feelings rubbing off on the youngest, but it wasn't doing him any harm, so they decided to let it slide. Sure, it sounds fun, Sabo said with a smile. Yeah, why not, I needed something to do anyway. Ace said with a shrug, though he was smiling as well. Alright, let's go. Hey, did you know that Rita was keeping me from putting away my fishing pole for almost a month? That guy, I swear, he nearly made Marco kill me. The brothers suppressed their laughter, Sabo putting on his best, really. I can't believe that. Face as he began sympathizing with the chef. The day passed by slowly, the three brothers fishing with Thatch until the chef had to go make lunch. When lunch came and passed and they realized Teach still wasn't back at the Moby, the three became disconcerted, and Luffy took it upon himself to go ask the captain where the man was, walking up to his chair after lunch, and doing the same thing he had done when he warned the captain of the man. He walked up to his leg where Whitebeard brought a hand down, lifting Luffy up to his ear where the boy whispered quietly to him. Where's Teach? He asked, wanting to know for everyone's safety. Whitebeard pulled the boy away, a serious expression on his face. He's been sent on a mission. We have someone watching him. Whitebeard said in a tone that told the brothers he was taking their warning to heart, something that relieved them to know. Luffy had nodded, a bit happy that they wouldn't be near the man for a bit, but a little unnerved that he had no idea what he was up to. After that the three had lounged around, not wanting to risk going on the island and running into a celestial dragon, but not having anything better to do. Most of the pirates were off enjoying themselves on the island, only a few lingering behind, namely the captain and a handful of commanders. Admos, King Du, Jiru, Blenheim, Vista, Fossa, Curiel, and Akuya were off on the island, while Izo, Namor, Thatch, Marco, Harita, and Joza were on the ship. After cloud gazing had gotten boring, the brothers were left with nothing to do until Thatch sauntered up to them, smile plastered on his face as he did. Time for some fun, he exclaimed with a clap of his hands. Sabo and Ace raised an eyebrow while Luffy became excited, ready to do anything other than what he was doing. And what exactly does that entail? Sabo asked, not quite sure what to expect from the chef. Thatch made a sking noise, wagging his finger in a no motion. No, we don't want to ruin the surprise, after all, that's half the fun. Thatch said happily, still smiling as he gestured for the brothers to follow him. A bit unsure and plenty skeptical, Ace and Sabo looked to Luffy for reassurance, to which the youngest nodded, stating there were no bad feelings from Thatch. So, with that, the three began to follow Thatch, curious as to what his surprise was. They ended up following him into the galley, and then into the kitchen which the brothers had never been in before. They followed him until they reached a station in the corner where Thatch pulled up some stools to the giant counter for the brothers to sit at, while he moved to one of the many fridges to get something. They all watched curiously as he began pulling out random things, from eggs and milk to flour and sugar, but having no clue what he was up to. All set, Thatch said finally, hands on his hips and smile on his lips as he stood proudly behind the mountain of ingredients on the table. What exactly is it? Sabo asked for all of them, noticing that even Luffy looked confused now. Thatch's smile never faltered though as he began explaining. Well, you three like to eat and it's been a while since we've had some sweets on board, so I've decided that tonight we can have some desserts after dinner, and I wanted you three to help. It's a lot better than doing nothing after all. Thatch said as he rolled up his sleeves in preparation. Ace and Sobble looked at each other, shrugging, while Luffy merely smiled, only really understanding that food was involved. Alright, we'll help. Ace said as he turned back to face Thatch, who cheered happily. Yes. First step, washing our hands. And so the brothers helped Thatch make a variety of desserts. Ace was in charge of a wide array of cookies, from peanut butter to chocolate chip to regular sugar cookies. Sobble was making cakes, chocolate, vanilla, 3-tiered, 2-tiered, and even a few dozen cupcakes as well. Luffy, on the other hand, was a bit of a different story. His brothers knew that letting Luffy near food preparation was a bad idea in itself. But Thatch had seemed to find a way to divert the youngest from eating all the unbaked goodies by providing him with breads and dips to eat, as he helped Thatch make puddings, pies, and even some homemade ice cream. Ace and Sobble had to admit they were amazed to see the youngest following directions so well, the boy completely focused on mixing fillings without losing a single drop. Good job, Luffy. Now, why don't you pour that into the pie while I go put these puddings in the fridge? Thatch said as he picked up trays with pudding and cups on it. Luffy nodded happily as the chef left, and Sobble watched the straw-hatted teen carefully pour the filling into the pie tin. Did you see that, Sobble? I did it. Luffy exclaimed happily as he quickly chowed down on another few pieces of bread. Sobble smiled, setting down the bowl of frosting he had just mixed up. I did. Good job, Lou. It looks good so far, Sobble said, meaning it too. It made Luffy beam in delight as Thatch walked back, explaining that they were going to cover the pie in more crust, while Sobble turned his attention to Ace, who was also surprisingly following directions pretty well. The oldest had his own bowl of breads and dips to munch on as he mixed batters and put cookie dough on trays to bake. The group continued on in their baking, and soon it was already time for dinner to start cooking, the other chefs coming into the kitchen and cooking in their own sections of the giant kitchen. As they finished up their baking, the chefs were announcing that they were done making the food, Thatch saying that they could start serving now while the brothers washed up. Thank you guys for helping. I don't know if I could have gotten that all done on my own, Thatch admitted as he dried his hands off. There was no problem, Sobble said as he dried his own hands off, ignoring the fact that Ace and Luffy were in a bit of a splashing war with each other. Yeah, I had lots of fun, Luffy said, stopping the war for a split second to direct his attention to the chef. Me too, Ace said quickly before flicking more water towards Luffy, who retaliated with his own flick of water, which was more of him throwing a handful of water towards the eldest. Sobble sighed, shaking his head and pinching his nose at his brother's antics, while Thatch merely began laughing. Come on, you two, if you don't stop now all the food'll be gone, Sobble said sternly, even though he knew that wasn't true. The more they got to know Thatch, the more comfortable they became around him, and if past experience was anything to go on, the man would save them something regardless of how long they took. The man looked like he wanted to voice this, but before he could, Ace and Luffy looked at Sobble with wide eyes. Luffy, move, I gotta finish washing my hands. No, you move, I was washing mine first, I don't wanna miss the meat. I'm older, so I should get to go first. Nah. Just cause you're older doesn't mean anything, I'm gonna wash mine first. No, you're not, I am. No? Sobble could only pinch his nose harder in exasperation. That was delicious, Ace said happily as he patted his stomach, the three brothers walking out on the deck. It was. I can't believe it's been so long since I've had a cookie, Sobble said, trying to remember the last time he'd had one. Yeah, Makino made the best cookies. Luffy reminisced happily, eyes going a bit distant as he remembered everyone back on Dawn Island. Everything ready? Yeah, all set, Captain. Go ahead. Alright then, inflate it. What's going on? Ace asked in a mumble, his brothers shrugging in response, just as confused as him. They watched curiously as suddenly a giant bubble began inflating around the ship, encasing them all safely within it. Whoa. Sugio, Luffy said in awe as he watched the bubble inflate until it was over the entire ship. We're heading down to Fishman Island now, Yuri. We should be there after lunch tomorrow, Marco said as he walked up to the awestruck brothers. So it really is at the bottom of the sea? Thatch mentioned it earlier, but I didn't really think there was an island at the bottom of the ocean, Sobble said as he watched the crew getting ready to do something else. Sure is. Say goodbye to the sky, cause all we're gonna see down there is water for a while, Izo said as he walked up as well, watching his crewmates hurry round the deck. We're good here. Here too. Looks like we're about to descend, Marco said, crossing his arms over his chest. And he was right. After he said that, the ship began to sink, but no water came through the bubble, everyone safe inside of it. Whoa. Sobble, Ace, look, we're going underwater, Luffy said as he rushed over to the railing to look. His brothers followed, both equally amazed as they watched the water slowly cover them completely until they were fully submerged, fish swimming peacefully around them, and roots tangling downward from the mangrove trees. The brothers remained at the railing in amazement for a good hour after that before Luffy began to yawn, and they decided they should probably get some sleep. They said goodnight to Marco and Izo as they left the deck, heading for their room. Today had been one of their good days, especially seeing as Teach was no longer around. Chapter 49. The Horde Shell Tower. It was a challenge to get Luffy to eat for the first time ever. The boy was so excited to go out on the deck and watch for Fishman Island that getting him to sit in the galley and eat lunch was harder than it should have been. The young teen kept trying to fill his mouth and run, but Sabo and Ace had learned by now and were holding a leg down each to keep him from bolting away without them. It wasn't that Luffy didn't want to eat, because the day that happened the brothers would panic. It was more that Luffy was so excited about the new island that it was distracting him until he remembered that there was food. Needless to say, lunch went by much faster than usual despite these difficulties. With Luffy scarfing food down faster than ever, the three were done pretty quickly, Ace and Sabo eating to match his pace, so they could keep the youngest from finishing before them and having nothing to do. Besides, if he did finish before them, it would be much harder to keep him in the galley while they finished. When they were all done eating, Luffy practically jumped out of his seat, grabbing his brother's hands. "Come on, I want to go look for the new island," Luffy said excitedly as he pulled his brothers out of the galley and along the deck to the rails. The crew around them all smiled at Luffy's eagerness, watching as he leaned over the rail to look through the tough bubble. "Look at that. Oh. And that. And look over there, it's a turtle." Some chuckled at his enthusiasm as they did their chores or walked past, enjoying how happy Luffy looked to just see some fish up close. "Ace, do you see the island yet?" Luffy asked as he tried peering through the darkness for any signs of it. "How would I be able to see anything down here?" Ace asked, only for show because, really, he could see it, and it was an amazing sight. "Yeah, I see it. It's inside in a bubble, which is inside another bubble. Also, it's weirdly light in there, and I'm pretty sure I'm seeing a sky and clouds, even though we're pretty deep in the water." Ace tapped as he scanned what he knew to be Fishman Island. "So that's what that weird light is." Sabo mused, seeing a dim light in the middle of all the darkness surrounding them. It was still pretty far away, but they would be there in about a half hour to an hour, judging by how far away it was. "How can there be sky and clouds underwater?" Luffy asked, though his excitement was only growing at the thought. "Who knows? I don't even know if I'm seeing that right," Ace replied as he tried squinting, wondering what could possibly look so similar to sky and clouds, without actually being sky and clouds. "We'll just have to wait to find out," Sabo said as he leaned on the railing, having a feeling that Luffy wasn't going to be leaving anytime soon. He was right. The half hour it took for them to get to Fishman Island, Luffy stood raptly at the railing, switching between talking silently to his brothers about all the cool stuff they would see, and talking out loud to the occasional commander that would come by. Ace, in the meanwhile, took the time to think back to everything that had happened to them recently. First, the Whitebeard pirate saved them from the facility, where they had previously been trapped for 7 whole years of their lives. Then, they were accepted on board this ship, no questions asked, and that was still something he was trying to get used to. He was just waiting for someone to get fed up and demand to know what had happened in the facility, but again, that had yet to happen. Then, the brothers were asked to join the crew, actually join, and that was an even bigger shocker than everything else. It's one thing to accept some kids traveling on board for a while, but to actually want them to stay permanently. It was mind-boggling to him. And then there was the biggest shock of all. His parentage. Of all the possibilities that came with telling people who his parents were, Whitebeards and Marcos were nowhere near close to the top of the list. In fact, they were probably as close to the bottom as they could be. They just accepted him. His parents. Gold D. Roger was his father, and all they had to say about it was that it didn't matter, which was one of the biggest lies he'd ever heard. Of course it mattered to the entire world, to the Marines, to Roger's enemies. He was the devil's son, someone everyone thought should have died the second he was born, regardless of the fact that he was just an innocent child. In the eyes of the world, just having the man's blood was a crime worthy of death, and yet Whitebeard and Marco had no problems with the information at all. They had accepted it as easily as they accepted the brothers on board their ship. For there to be no fuss about his parents, for the pirates to just accept him, he couldn't understand it. However, he was forced to stop thinking about all of this when Luffy began tugging on his hand, happily exclaiming that they were almost there. He would just have to worry about all of this later. As they arrived, they saw the entrance to Fishman Island open, Sabo hearing guards inside announcing that Whitebeard was arriving as they did. The ship coasted in easily, and soon the brothers were staring in awe again as they looked up at the clouds, the sky, the fishermen women and mermaids men. So there was clouds in the sky. Ace muttered quietly as he looked up, pleased to know that his enhanced eyesight wasn't playing tricks on him. The crew around them immediately got to work on docking the ship, and within minutes they were getting ready to disembark. "Marco, Thatch, when you take the boys, can you go look for Jin? I'll need to speak to him about everything that's happened since we've last been here," Whitebeard said as he addressed the different duties of all the crew members. The two commanders nodded, and when everyone was ready they headed to the brothers. "Alright you three, you ready?" Thatch asked with a smile. Double-checking that they were all wearing their wristbands, Sabo nodded. Even if this was a Whitebeard-protected island, they still didn't want to take any chances. "Then let's go, Yoi," Marco said as he led the way off the ship. Luffy could barely contain himself as he skipped alongside his brothers, the older two holding his hands, so he couldn't run off alone. As they walked, everyone they passed gave them smiles once they saw they were with the Whitebeards, and many began whispering happily to each other, Sabo picking up that they were excited to see the pirates again. Marco, where do you think Jinbe is? Thatch asked from where he stood at the front of the group beside Marco. I don't think we need to worry too much, Yuri. He'll probably find us. For now, why don't we take the brothers to the shopping section? Marco asked, turning to get the brothers' opinions. Yeah. Come on Ace, Sabo, let's go shopping. Luffy cheered happily. The two saw no reason why they shouldn't, so they nodded as well, and once again followed Marco and Thatch to the many shops set up in town. Of course, one of these shops had the words, John's Candy Shop printed clearly on it, and that enticed Luffy immediately. Candy Ace, Sabo, let's go get some candy. Luffy said, pulling his brothers toward the shop, Marco and Thatch following with bemused expressions on their faces. We can get some candy, Luffy, but not a lot. Too much sugar isn't good for you. Sabo compromised, knowing that the boy had a tendency to go overboard, and he did not want to see what Luffy was like with that much sugar in him. After being dragged into the store and fighting to keep Luffy from eating everything, the group left with a good-sized bag of candy, Luffy attempting to swipe something from it every few seconds. You know, I don't blame him for being eager. The candy they make here is supposedly some of the best in the world. Thatch commented as he watched Ace raise the bag just out of reach of Luffy's grabby hands. That may be the case, but I think it's best for us all if we limit Luffy's intake, Sabo said with a smile as he allowed Luffy to have one of the taffies from the bag. As they browsed through different stores, another thing that caught Luffy's eye was the bubbly coral. Look Sabo, look Ace, it makes bubbles. Luffy said as he tested one of the corals they had on display. It's for humans, so they can be mobile in water and still breathe if they need to, Yoi, Marco explained, pulling out one of his own bubbly corals that he had brought along. Really, that's so cool. We have to get one. Luffy said, already grabbing some off the shelves for him and his brothers. This was mostly how the rest of the shopping trip went. Luffy would read a sign, and Sabo would curse himself for ever teaching the glutton how to read. Every time they would go and Luffy would manage to somehow rope Ace and Sabo into yet another purchase. This probably would have continued for the rest of the day had they not been interrupted. Thatch, Marco, it's good to see you two again. A voice spoke up, drawing everyone's attention toward it. Ah, Jin. So you did find us after all. Thatch said with a smile as he greeted the blue fishman. The brothers watched the newcomer skeptically for a moment, while Luffy got a read of the man's aura and feelings. I did. I heard Oyaji dock not too long ago, and thought I would try to come find you guys. I had a feeling you would be closer to the boat or restocking near the docking section. What brings you to the tourist section? Jin asked with a raised eyebrow. What's he look like, Lu? Ace asked, knowing that any second this Jin person's attention would be on them. Blue. No bad feelings. Luffy determined after a second, blinking as he turned his attention to the eldest. That would be because of these three, Yoi, Marco said as he gestured to the brothers. Sabo and Luffy gave Jin smiles, Sabo deciding he would be polite, yet cautious around the man. Meanwhile, Ace was giving the fishman a calculating look, arms crossed as he decided if it was okay to be near this guy. Boy, just recruiting youngsters now? Jin asked curiously as he looked over the teens. Luffy pouted now but didn't sense maliciousness in the words. Not exactly. These three are a special case. Maybe we'll tell you about it later. Thatch said with a nonchalant shrug which Jin seemed to expect. Hi, I'm Sabo, and these are my brothers. Luffy's the youngest and Ace is the oldest. Sabo introduced politely, seeing that now was a good time to do it. It's nice to meet you three, I'm Jin. Jin greeted just as politely, and Luffy decided he liked the fishman. He could feel the loyalty in him, and that was a good feeling. Oyaji wanted to talk to you about a report when you've got the time, Yoi, Marco said after introductions were over. I know, I met up with him at the Mobi when I was looking for you. Which reminds me, I was recently at the Ryuga Palace, and Neptune wanted to greet you personally. He'd like for you to come see him. Jin said as he looked up. The brothers followed his gaze, Sabo and Luffy just making out something in the distance, but Ace could see that it was a weird blockade like the entrance that led to another bubble above it. Inside that bubble was a regal-looking palace that Ace assumed to be the Ryuga Palace. He relayed all of this information to his brothers. Really? I wouldn't mind seeing the big guy again. Last time we went they made some pretty good food. Thatch said with a smile as he thought about the feast that had been prepared. As long as he wouldn't mind the brothers coming along with us, Yoi, Marco said, bringing everyone's attention back to the fact that the two commanders were accompanying the three. I'm sure he wouldn't mind at all. Neptune's pretty understanding. Jin said coolly. Ah, that's not necessary. We can go back to the Mobi if it'll be too much trouble. Sabo said with a smile, waving his hands. After all, the brothers didn't exactly have the best track record when it came to royalty and nobles. Jin raised a hand of his own. Nonsense, the more the merrier. Come, I'm sure they've already started cooking the feast. Jin said as he turned, whistling for something. Out of nowhere, a giant fish came down, a bubble around its midsection, as it lowered just enough for the group to board the seating on its back. The brothers were a bit wary, but Thatch and Marco seemed to trust this guy, and Luffy had said he was good colors. Not to mention, there was gonna be a feast, and they would be able to ride on the back of this giant fish. Let's be cautious. Ace tapped as he began to follow Marco and Thatch onto the back of the fish. Sabo and Luffy nodded minutely as they followed as well, all of them inwardly excited about what was to come, yet nervous for what could happen. After they were all on the fish, they began ascending up to the entrance Ace had seen. On their way up, Marco and Thatch both got out their bubbly coral, explaining to the brothers that the palace was full of water. Hearing this, Sabo took out their own bubbly coral, surrounding the three of them in their own bubble. When the fish reached the top of the bubble, Jin used a den to call the guards inside the palace, telling them that they were there. The entrance opened, a stream of water rushing down to the now open entrance, and the fish quickly swam in, taking them up to another bubble containing the Ryuga Palace. Wow. This is so cool. Luffy said in amazement as he peered around them. Once they were out of the stream and in front of the palace, Luffy lit up, eyes sparkling at the immaculately decorated building. As Hugio, Luffy cried as he took it all in. Sabo sat in a similar state of awe, while Ace tried his best to look unsurprised. After all, he had seen it from below, what's so special about seeing it up close? Despite this thought though, Ace's eyes couldn't help but roam over the detailed statues and structures. The doors to the palace opened and Jin got off the fish, the rest of them following him as he walked in. What have I said about trying to do strenuous work? You have to be more responsible, you know it'll strain you back. You're right, I'm sorry. And not to mention, you're always sneaking off alone, do you know how dangerous it is? I'm sorry, Jamin. And another thing. Minister of the left, Minister of the right, King Neptune, I've returned with the Whitebeard pirates and their guests, Jin said with a smile, interrupting the scolding coming from the group. The three turned to face them, a look of surprise on their faces. Ah, Marco, Thatch, it's good to see you two again. How's Whitebeard, Jamin? The giant merman asked as he swam forward to them. He's well, you're. How about yourself? Marco asked politely, the man smiling pleasantly. Just fine. Ah, who are your guests? He asked as he looked over to the brothers who tensed up a bit. This was clearly the king, or at least some sort of royalty if the giant crown was anything to go on. This is Ace, Sabo, and Luffy. The brothers who are staying on the Mobi for a while, well, indefinitely really. Thatch said with a grin. The giant raised an eyebrow but smiled regardless. Oh? That's interesting. It's nice to meet you boys, Jamin. I'm Neptune, king of the Ryuga kingdom. Neptune greeted cheerfully. Sabo smiled and bowed, Luffy mimicking him and Ace begrudgingly doing so as well. The pleasure is all ours, your majesty, Sabo said in as polite a tone he could manage, using his noble upbringing to his advantage, even if it did make his stomach churn in disgust at the thought of memories from so long ago. Please, just Neptune is fine, Neptune said with a laugh as the three rose once more. Luffy did what he does best, scanning everyone as quick as he could as he rose, eyes jumping from one guard to the next, until they finally landed on the blue aura of the king. Good people. Luffy told his brothers. Well, the feast should be ready soon, Jamin. In the meanwhile, why don't I catch you up on everything that's been happening here on the island since your last visit? Neptune asked, the two commanders nodding in interest. Sabo began to pay close attention to the conversation, wanting to know as much about the people on Fishman Island as possible, in case there was anyone they should actively try to stay away from. Meanwhile, Luffy was beginning to get bored. Ace was paying close attention to the people around them, in case anyone did anything to endanger them, but that left Luffy with nothing to do. He had already checked everyone's auras, and after checking the mass pull of feelings in the room, he found none of them to be malicious. With nothing to do, Luffy began to get a bit antsy. He knew better than to do anything to attract unwanted attention, but when a suddenly delicious smell wafted to his enhanced senses, his mouth began to water. The giant king guy had said that there was going to be a feast. Would he be mad if Luffy just so happened to show up to the feast a bit earlier than the others? Shifting his weight between either foot, Luffy began having a war in his head. On one hand, Luffy was starving, even if he had been snacking on delicious food in the town before this. On the other, he didn't want to get in trouble for doing something wrong. But the food smelled so good, it was practically calling to him. Luffy hadn't even come to a decision when his feet seemed to move on their own toward the smell of food that invaded his senses. Ace was quick to notice the moving boy and grabbed his hand, following after him as he used their silent language to get Sabo's attention. Luffy, where are you going? Sabo asked as he glanced from the conversation that the adults were having, and then to Luffy who was nearly out of the entrance hall entirely, Ace following close behind. There's food this way. Luffy replied absent-mindedly, Sabo slinking off after his brother, being careful not to be spotted by anyone. Luffy, we can't just wander off, someone's gonna notice. Ace said with a frown as he looked back to the room they had just left, seeing that, so far, no one had noticed their departure. But it smells so good. They said there was gonna be a feast, right? Luffy asked as they walked further down the unknown hallways. Yeah, but that doesn't mean we can just go there. Besides, it would be a little weird if they found us in the dining hall without knowing how to get there in the first place. Sabo replied with worry, wanting to get back to Thatch and Marco before they inevitably noticed the brothers' disappearance. Come on now Luffy, let's go back. Ace said as he stopped walking, tugging on Luffy's hand to get the boy to go back with him. Despite his want for food, Luffy knew better than to argue with Ace, especially when it came to their safety. With a pout, Luffy nodded, turning to follow his older brothers back to the entrance, but they hadn't even made 2 steps in that direction when Sabo froze, turning to look back where they had been going. Sabo. What's wrong? Ace asked in a whisper as he looked back down the hall as well. A little further down the way, he could see a weird divide where it looked like the water ended and it was air instead, but it made it hard to see what was past the divide, the water distorting everything. He could see that there was someone down there, and he could see that they were pushing something, but he couldn't quite figure out what it was with all the blur. I hear it's a rolling cart, like back at the facility, Sabo said in a hushed, almost choked voice, as flashbacks no doubt ran through his head at lightning speed because of the familiar sound. But they're making a feast, so maybe it's for moving food. Ace asked, wondering why the sound would make Sabo so nervous all of a sudden. They'd heard a similar sounding cart on the Moby before, and though Sabo had been a bit disoriented by it before, he had never looked as scared over it. It's not just that, but I can hear crying coming from over there too, Sabo said, paler than he had been a moment ago. Ace frowned at this, and Luffy began looking around nervously. Should we check it out? Ace asked a bit hesitantly, not knowing what to do with the information. I don't know what are the chances of a facility being in a place like this. Is there even more than one facility? Sabo questioned nervously, not sure if he wanted to know the answer to either question. After all, the thought of more than one facility existing in the world was a terrifying thought. Their facility had been on an island where the villagers knew and allowed it, so it wouldn't be too far-fetched to think that a whole kingdom could know and hide a facility as well. But that would mean that the Whitebeard pirates knew about this facility too. If that was the case, then that meant there was a possibility that they were here to take the brothers to another facility. Sabo? Luffy asked, a look of nervousness on his face, and Sabo had no doubt that his little brother had been picking up on his emotions, influencing his own as a result. What's wrong, Sabo? Ace asked, just as nervous, knowing that whatever Sabo thought up, it wasn't good. Hopefully nothing. Maybe we should go check it out, after all, if it is a facility, that means we should leave. Now. Sabo said a bit quickly. None of them wanted to check it out, but all of them knew that Sabo was right. So, with a lot of reluctance, the 3 began heading back towards where Luffy had been smelling the food, more on guard than ever before. The walk felt like an eternity, but soon enough they were walking out of the water and into the air, their bubbles disappearing as they did. Up ahead, Ace could see a giant rolling cart, whatever having been on it gone now as a giant fishman pushed it towards them. The brothers managed to walk around the cart at just the right angle, the guard not noticing their presence in the slightest as they did. Continuing on down the hall, they saw a giant pair of doors, shut and locked with dent marks on it. The crying's coming from in there, Sabo said hesitantly as they looked up at the massive entrance. The food smelled too, Luffy whispered, tilting his head as he wondered how they would get in. Looking around quickly, Sabo turned to Ace. Is anyone around? Any surveillance snails? Sabo asked. Ace raised an eyebrow at the question but looked around regardless. Not seeing anything, he turned back to Sabo, shaking his head. No, nothing, why? Ace asked. Sabo turned to look back at the door, frowning. Luffy, do you think you could stretch your arm up there and pull the door open? Sabo asked, his brothers now understanding the need for caution. Luffy looked at how far away the handle was, calculating quickly in his head if he could reach it or not. Yeah, I think so, Luffy said, stepping back a few steps and winding his arm up to stretch. He hadn't been able to stretch it too far lately, only a few inches when they were alone in their room, so it would be nice to finally use his powers like this. Ace was keeping a close eye for anything that might see them, while Sabo listened for anyone who might be coming. Winding back, Luffy swung his arm, extending it all the way to the handle and grabbing it successfully. The giant door was sturdy, and because of that, and its size, it was also heavy. It wasn't too much of a challenge, but it still took a bit of struggle for Luffy to pull open the door a few inches, so that he and his brothers would be able to fit inside. Good job, Lou, Sabo whispered as he and his brothers inched nervously to the crack in the door. The room inside was dark, but Ace was able to easily see that it looked nothing like how their facility had looked. It looked more like a bedroom. What's inside, Ace? Sabo asked as he and Luffy peered uselessly inside, unable to see anything. I think it's a bedroom. There's a bed over there and a dresser and stuff. It's all pretty big though, like that King Neptune guy big. Ace said as he took a step into the room, his brothers following while holding onto his shirt for guidance. Maybe it's a decoy, like how they pretended we were part of a mental hospital. Sabo mused while Ace began looking for anything like a door that would lead to an actual facility. A soft cry, though, caught all their attention as they spun to face the owner of the noise. Is there a person in here? Luffy asked quietly. I don't know, I don't see anyone, but I can't see on the bed, it's too high up. Ace whispered back, thinking that maybe they should start communicating silently to each other, now that there was possibly a person in here with them. I can feel a presence in front of us, and I think breathing too. Is that where the bed is? Sabo asked as he used his hockey and enhanced hearing, seeming to think the same thing as Ace, as he switched to tapping rather than speaking. Ace reached out with his own hockey, and even though he wasn't that good at observation hockey, he was still able to pick up the presence of someone in front of them like Sabo had. Yeah, maybe someone's on it. Should we climb up and check it out? Ace asked, wanting the confirmation before he led his brothers towards a potential danger that they couldn't even see. Sabo hesitated, still not sure how they should proceed, but knowing that they were already too far into this. Why don't you go check it out? Luffy and I can stay here seeing as we can't even see anything to begin with. Sabo said a bit reluctantly. Ace nodded, though no one saw it, and began moving away from his brothers, Sabo dropping his grip of his shirt, but Luffy didn't, instead tugging on it a bit, making Ace turn to him in question. Be careful, Ace. Luffy said, a frown present on his face and a look of worry to go with it. The eldest smiled, knocking Luffy's straw hat off and ruffling his hair. Always am, Lu. Ace replied. This got the youngest to release his grip as well, grabbing out for Sabo's hand, which he found, while Ace turned back to the bed, grabbing the blanket hanging off of it, and tugging it to make sure it wouldn't fall with his weight. Finding that it was sturdy enough for him to climb on, he began ascending up the side of the bed, quiet rustles being the only indicator for Sabo and Luffy that Ace was still moving. When it grew quiet, they assumed that Ace had reached the top, and Sabo kept his ears trained for any noise he could pick up. He could still hear the faint sounds of what could be breathing, and now he swore that was a muffled step from Ace. I think someone's under the covers. They're huge too, just like the king. Ace confirmed, Sabo, picking up the tapping even from where he stood. He relayed the information to Luffy, the boy shifting his weight nervously. Let me get a bit closer, yeah, it's a person, I think they're asleep, maybe they weren't the ones crying earlier. Ace questioned. A sudden bang on the door made them all jump and spin to face it, but there was no one there. What was that? Luffy asked as he looked at the door with wide eyes, trying to calm down. Crap, I think they're waking up, I'm coming back down. Ace tapped a bit frantically, and Sabo could hear the frantic rustling, as Ace quickly maneuvered his way down the blanket and back onto the solid ground. He had only just managed to touch the floor when a light suddenly flickered on. H, hello. Is someone there? The high-pitched feminine voice sounded shaky and nervous, but loud all the same. Sabo tightened his hold on Luffy's hand and pulled him over to Ace, pushing them all under the bed out of sight. Megalo, do you see anyone? This confused the brothers because they hadn't seen anyone else in the room. Reaching out with their hockey, they noticed another presence, but this one was a bit different from the person on the bed, more animal-like. There wasn't much time to linger on that thought because suddenly the edge of the blanket behind them began moving, and a snout poked its way under. They didn't have a chance to find another hiding spot before a shark's face was staring right at them. Immediately, the shark began growling at them, shimmying under the bed and forcing the brothers to leave the cover. What is it? Oh, who are you? The three turned to look at the fearful mermaid sitting on the bed. She had her hands to her mouth, and her eyes were wide, already beginning to water with unshed tears. Why, you're here to kill me, aren't you? We will, IW won't let you. I'm not scared. The giant mermaid said, voice timid compared to her words. The shark was still growling at them, even snapping a few times in warning. The brothers were at a loss in terms of what they should do. They didn't want to draw any attention to themselves, but they were in a bit of a pickle now seeing as they'd been caught. They still had no idea what was happening, and were even more confused by why this girl thought they were going to kill them, but now wasn't the time to worry about that. Ah, no, that's not why we're here, Sabo said, raising his hands in a peaceful manner. I wouldn't be fooled. I'm Neptune's daughter, so I'm not scared. The mermaid cried, and now the brothers knew that this was a princess they were dealing with, not a kid locked in another facility. I'm not scared, I'm not. Tears started falling, making loud splashing noises as they did, and the brothers winced as she began wailing loudly. Father Sama, Brother Sama. She cried, bringing her hands to her eyes as tears fell faster. Oh great, that's not good. Ace muttered with a frown, anxiety beginning to take form as he realized that somebody would surely come now that the princess was sobbing. Really, we're not here to hurt you, promise. Sabo said, ignoring Ace as he tried to calm the situation down. The shark was still growling, in between the brothers and the princess protectively as he did. Why is she saying she's not scared? She's really scared and sad. Luffy said, confused as he stared at the wailing princess. SHH, calm down. Sabo was cut off as he heard a whistling in the air behind them, as if something was heading their way, fast. Something's coming. He hissed to his brothers, all three of them spinning to face whatever it was. Ace could clearly see something heading their way, and he was pretty sure it was Ace's sword. He couldn't even tell his brothers about it because it was suddenly right in front of them all, and it took everything the brothers had to block the sword from coming any closer. The three used as much hockey as they could muster to block the sword from moving anymore, the force of it pushing them back a bit, until they were able to push it away, allowing it to fly harmlessly into the wall. What was that about? Ace asked as he looked at the weapon now lying uselessly on the ground. Again, there was no time for anyone to answer because Sabo could hear the sounds of footsteps heading their way. Shirahashi, who had stopped crying in the midst of everything happening, was staring silently between the brothers, the sword, and the door. Crap, I think guards are coming, Sabo muttered as he frowned. The brothers were definitely done for now. Well, that's just great, what else could go hey? Ace couldn't even finish complaining as the princess scooped the brothers up in her hands, muttering a quick sorry before hiding them behind her back. What's the big idea? SHH, she's hiding us Ace, calm down. Sabo whispered to Ace, he and Luffy sitting in the princess's hands. Ace stopped talking as the guards rushed in, asking what was wrong. Oh, I think I had a bad dream. The mermaid princess said in an apologetic voice. Was that all? Why is the door open? Did someone come in? One of the guards asked, making the princess shift nervously. It must have been the one who brought my food. She asked a bit hesitantly. She didn't want to get anyone in trouble, but the three humans had just saved her life, so it was the least she could do right. I'll have to speak to him about proper safety techniques. Oh, that reminds me. The Whitebeard pirates are here again. The guard said, and the mermaid lit up. Really? She asked happily. That's right. They brought some guests with them too, apparently they're honorary members, but they seem to have gotten lost in the castle somewhere. If you see them don't hesitate to call us, the pirates are worried about them. It was a strange thing to hear that someone was worried about the brothers, especially seeing as they hadn't even been with the pirates a month yet, but it was also nice to hear. To be honest, it made them feel a bit bad that they had worried them. I will, the princess said, bringing the three out of their musings. There was the sound of the door closing as the guards left and the princess sighed, moving her hands back in front of her as she looked at the brothers, a look of worry on her face. Thank you three very much. I was being very rude before, please forgive me. I didn't know you were with the Whitebeards. What are your names? She asked. Well, I'm Sabo and these are my brothers Ace and Luffy. What's your name? Sabo asked politely. The princess smiled. I'm Shirahashi, King Neptune's daughter. You're with the Whitebeards, so you're good people, right? Shirahashi asked. Yeah. You're a good person too. Luffy said matter-of-factly, taking in the bright blue aura around the princess, almost just as, if not more, bright than Ace and Sabo's. Anyways, what was with that sword? Ace asked, looking back over to the weapon that the guards had failed to notice earlier. That's a good question. Who threw it? And from where? Sabo asked as he also examined the weapon closer, taking in the rose pattern on its hilt. I know who threw it, Shirahashi said solemnly, a frown on her face as she turned to look at the sword. Was it a bad person? Luffy asked with a frown as well. I guess you could call him that. His name is Vanderdecken. He holds a grudge against me for refusing to marry him. That gentleman has a devil's power called Mado Mado. Shirahashi explained. The three frowned as they listened. Mado Mado? What's it do? Ace asked. It allows him to strike me anywhere anytime with a thrown weapon, since he designated me as his mark. That's why it's too dangerous for me to leave this hard shell tower. Shirahashi finished. As she did, Luffy's stomach crumbled and she looked down in shock. Sorry, I'm still hungry. Chapter 50. Worried pirates and nicknames. Sorry, I'm still hungry. Luffy laughed, rubbing the back of his head as his brothers rolled their eyes. Oh, well you can have my food if you want, Shirahashi said with a smile as she gestured to the giant plates of food beside her. Wah! Really? Luffy asked, eyes sparkling in delight and mouth watering in anticipation as he stared at the feast in front of them. You did save me after all, and you're with the Whitebeards. It's the least I can do. Shirahashi said happily as she lowered her hand over to the food. Luffy cheered and jumped over to the food, Ace close behind, while Sabo followed at a much slower pace, shaking his head at his brother's antics. Ace and Luffy began chowing down, Sabo opting to take a much smaller portion, while Shirahashi watched in amazement. So, this Vanderdecken guy wants to marry you, but he's trying to kill you. That doesn't make much sense. Ace said, mouth full as he spoke. Luffy nodded his agreement beside his brother as he took a bite out of the bread. It's been 5 years already, Shirahashi said, as if it wasn't all that big a deal. 5 years? You must be bored. Luffy said as he swallowed. This time Ace nodded in agreement as he took a sip of the water. On top of that, my father made a rule that the guards can't stay here for more than 5 minutes. Megalo here is the only one I can talk to. He's my dear friend. The mermaid princess said a bit solemnly now as she looked over to the shark who was close by. That sounds like no fun at all, Luffy said with a frown as he began slurping up a piece of seaweed. Not really. Anyway, you humans sure eat a lot even though you're small. She said, observing the mass amounts of food Ace and Luffy were scarfing down in record time. Don't use those two as reference. Regular humans eat much smaller portions. I, for example, am quite content with just this much. Sabo said as he showed his much smaller portion of food, more comparable to how much normal humans ate. Shirahashi giggled at that, resting her head in her hand. So you three are with the Whitebeards, right? Do you guys go on a lot of adventures? She asked wistfully, looking off somewhere. Well, we haven't been with them long, but they have gone on quite a few if Whitebeard's stories are anything to go on, Sabo said with a smile as he thought back to the stories the old man would tell them. Oh yeah? Have you ever seen the sun? There are stars in the night sky, aren't there? And there are different kinds of flowers and hairy animals. Have you ever been to a green place called a forest? Shirahashi asked with a dreamy look in her eye. Sabo laughed a bit nervously at all the questions, while Ace and Luffy eyed her weirdly as they continued eating. That's a lot of questions, but yes, basically, yes to all of them, Sabo said, ticking off fingers as he tried remembering all the questions. Really, I've always wanted to see those places. But it would be selfish for me to leave my room. The princess said, looking over to the giant doors sadly, sighing a bit as tears began welling up again. Sabo didn't know what to say to that, especially seeing as the mermaid looked to be on the verge of crying again. You can't leave because of that Vader Deck guy, right? Luffy asked as he and Ace finished up the last of the food. Sabo mindlessly corrected Luffy's mispronunciation of Vanderdecken's name, while Shirahashi nodded, turning back to look at the brothers. So we just gotta stop him, right? And then you can leave. Ace said, crossing his arms and frowning. Why yes, but no one's been able to find him, Shirahashi said, eyebrows slanting in worry. Don't worry about that, princess. Anyways, I think we should be leaving now. If what the guard said is true, the commanders are worried about us. Sabo said, standing and smoothing his down. Ace and Luffy nodded in agreement, both getting ready to leave as well. Before they were able to say goodbye though, the princess began sobbing again. You three are really nice. Thank you for wanting to help me. I'm sorry I kept you here so long. She sobbed, Ace stinging at the tears. And I thought Luffy was a crybaby. He muttered though Shirahashi didn't hear over her crying. Regardless, Sabo elbowed his brother while Luffy laughed. It's no worry princess, anyways, I guess this is goodbye for now. Sabo said as he and his brothers jumped onto the bed, narrowly avoiding a falling teardrop, and making their way down the blanket. Goodbye Sabo-sama. Luffy-sama. Ace-sama. Shirahashi said, tears still falling as she waved goodbye to them, Megalo waving as well. The three went to the doors, Sabo listening to make sure no one was near, and then pushed them open with his brothers, enough for them to slip out. Once out they shut the doors again, looking around once they were out. Now, let's hope they're not mad about our little disappearing act, Sabo said with a sigh. Ace and Luffy nodded, and the three began heading off in random directions, waiting to randomly come across someone. It would be better if they were actually lost in the depths of the castle, so that it would look more believable to whoever found them. It didn't take long for Sabo to hear Thatch and Marco talking, and to lead his brothers in their direction. Maybe Marines got here without us noticing and took them. Marco, what if they were caught again, and we didn't even realize, Thatch said with a worried voice, making Sabo wince a bit in guilt that they had worried the chef so much. I'm sure they're fine, Yuri, and if they were taken Aji would go after them, Marco replied with his normally stoic tone, but Sabo was sure he heard a bit of worry in it as well. Well, yeah, but there you three are. We were so worried. Thatch said, tears of joy springing to his eyes as he ran over to them, looking as if he was going to hug them. They tensed a bit, not exactly ready for the physical touch, but allowed it regardless, trying their best not to squirm or push him away. After all, they had been trying to get more comfortable around the pirates, and that meant being able to physically interact with them without fear that they would stab them in the back while they did. Oh, sorry, Sabo stuttered out, entirely focused on not pushing the commander away, and not paying attention to how articulate he was. Thatch pulled away, a relieved smile on his face, while Marco watched with his arms crossed, shaking his head at the chef's antics. Luffy gets bored easily and wandered off in the middle of your talk, so Ace and I went after him, but we got a bit lost, Sabo explained after regaining his composure. We're sorry to have worried you. Sabo apologized, bowing slightly. Oh, don't worry about that, I'm just glad you three are safe. Right, Marco. Thatch asked, grinning to the commander who nodded. Let's get back to Neptune, Yuri. I think the banquet is ready. Marco said, and Luffy could feel the previous worry that had come from the commander to spell into calmness. Luffy smiled happily and nodded, grabbing his brother's hands and following behind the commanders. Even though they had just eaten Ace and Luffy would happily eat more. So, did you guys see anything cool in the palace? Thatch asked as they walked. Sabo refrained from mentioning the fact that they had met the mermaid princess, and instead opted for shaking his head. No, we didn't look in any rooms, just wandered through the halls. Sabo lied easily because there was no way he was telling him the truth. Well, I guess that's for the best, this is a palace after all. It wouldn't do us any good to get caught snooping into things we didn't mean to find. Thatch said with a shrug, but there was a mischievous feel about him that said he wouldn't mind doing exactly that. Sabo smiled at that and nodded, agreeing with the chef's words. It didn't take much longer for the group to wander back into the entrance hall where Neptune was talking to some guards, the two ministers by his side. Neptune, we found them. Thatch said cheerfully as they walked up to the king. Neptune turned with surprise but smiled happily. Fantastic, Jamin. Then let's go to the banquet hall and celebrate. Neptune announced, and the brothers couldn't help but smile at the enthusiasm. It was strange to them that, even though this was a palace with, no doubt, high security, no one questioned the brothers' disappearance. Surely they might be bothered over the fact that they had potentially been able to witness something they didn't want others to know. However, that didn't seem to be the case as they walked into the banquet hall, and the brothers' little excursion hadn't been brought up once. Food came out in waves, and as the group was seated, plates were filled. Sabo gave a quick reminder to his brothers to attempt to use the manners they had learned seeing as they were in a palace, and they were, in their minds at least, on thin ice with everything that had happened. Conversation was made as food was eaten. Topics such as updates about the island, where they could resupply, where they were heading next, etc. were mentioned while the brothers ate their food silently. This was probably the first time since Shanks' party that the brothers had a chance to fill up as much as they wanted. Sure, they had been eating more on the Moby now, but it was more of the necessary amount rather than the amount that they would like to eat. Now, however, they were able to have 2 meals without anyone being the wiser. As the food diminished and the banquet ended, they all said their goodbyes to the king and the ministers, as well as Jin. Marco and Thatch began heading out, the brothers close behind when Sabo picked up on a conversation between 2 guards. I swear I locked that door, who would be crazy enough not to? I don't know, man, maybe you thought you closed it, and it didn't latch correctly. No, I'm telling you, I did the usual protocol, even waited a minute to make sure it wasn't going to slip open. Oh well, as long as Princess Shirahashi was fine. We'll just have to be extra careful next time. Maybe all those weapons are taking a toll on the door. Maybe. The mutter from the guard didn't sound all that convinced, making Sabo wince. Yeah, they would have to be extra careful from now on. Welcome back, my sons, how was it? Whitebeard asked from where he sat in his chair as they arrived back on the Moby. It was good, Oyaji, Marco said, walking up to the giants. Yeah, we had another banquet. Those royals sure know how to throw a good feast. Thatch said dreamily as he thought up the many different things he could cook with the inspiration he got from their meal. I don't doubt it. Whitebeard laughed. The brothers watched as the 2 commanders began chatting with the captain, and decided they would head off to their room. It was getting late now, the group having spent the entire rest of the day on the island and having dinner at the palace. They slipped off silently into the catacombs of the Moby and headed to their room, Ace yawning and stretching as they did. I wish we could have more feasts like that. It was delicious. And we got to eat so much, right, Ace? Luffy asked happily as he thought back to their day. Sure did, Lou. Maybe we can do something like that again one day. Ace views, a small smile on his face. The food was pretty good, not to mention plentiful. Sabo agreed, thinking back to the giant-sized portions that had been served. They reached their room after that, the 3 filing in quickly and shutting the door behind them. Ace and Luffy immediately went straight to the beds, pulling off their wristbands and flinging them over to their desk without even looking. Sabo rolled his eyes, taking off his own wristband and walking over to the desk, placing his with his brother's. If you lose those then you can't go on islands, you know, Sabo said with a hint of a smile as he did. What? Ace, you almost made me lose mine. Luffy cried as he looked over to their wristbands with wide eyes. What do you mean I made you? You threw it, not me. Ace retorted angrily, but Luffy wasn't hearing it, instead pouting and crossing his arms, looking away from the eldest. Meanie, you don't want me going on islands. He muttered, only riling Ace up more. Sabo laughed, getting into bed and deciding to defuse the situation he had sort of started. Now, calm down, they're still safe, you've just got to be more careful with them next time, Sabo said, ruffling Luffy's hair, his straw hat sitting on his lap. The youngest beamed at him and nodded, promising he would be more careful with it. Whatever. Anyways, what are we gonna do about that Vanderdecken guy? Ace asked as he crossed his arms behind his head, laying down and staring at the ceiling. Sabo frowned and lay down as well. We're gonna beat him up. Luffy said as if it were obvious. We could, but the pirates don't know we can fight, remember? If we just show up to the palace and say we've defeated him, there's going to be a lot of questions. Sabo said softly, paranoid that someone would hear their conversation. But Luffy mumbled as he laid down as well, frowning a little. But we are going to help Shibusashi, right? Luffy asked, completely butchering the poor princess's name. Sabo smiled gently at that. It's Shirahashi, Luffy, not Shibusashi. He corrected, the youngest's face scrunching in confusion. But that's hard to pronounce. Shibusashi's easier. He said as if it made everything okay. Remember the conversation we had before? Sometimes your nicknames can hurt people, even if you don't mean it. Sabo chastised gently, knowing that, sometimes, Luffy just couldn't be bothered to do something without good reason. Oh yeah, he mumbled quietly, frowning a bit at that. He didn't want to hurt good people, and Shibusashi was a good person. Even if she did cry a lot, which he knew made Ace mad. Regardless, we are going to help her, so don't worry about that, Sabo reassured. The princess's situation reminded them all too much about their own experience at the facility, being locked up without any freedom. Of course, while they were in a dark cold cell and barely fed anything, Shirahashi was in a warm comfortable room and fed extravagant meals. Even so, a cage is still a cage, no matter how nice it is. But we don't know how. Ace stated with a hint of annoyance in his tone, showing that he very much just wanted to go beat the man up and get this over with. Sabo sighed, already knowing this was going to be a tricky plan to pull off, and they didn't even really have a plan. Right now, no, we don't. I guess we're just going to have to see what happens tomorrow. Odds are though that we're going to have to fight him. I don't see a guy who chased after the princess for 5 years stopping now just because we asked politely. Sabo said as he thought about how they could pull this off. You're right about that. Ace muttered as he got comfy on the bed, closing his eyes, but still listening. Maybe Ace can use his haki. Luffy suggested happily, and his brothers looked over to him with wide eyes. Did you just suggest something smart? Ace asked in disbelief, mouth gaping at the idea. Meanie, Luffy said, knowing the words were an insult. He could be smart, just not as smart as Sabo. Speaking of, the blonde tried, but failed, to remove the shock from his face and address the suggestion. Well, that could work, but it's not a guarantee, it doesn't work on everyone, remember? Sabo asked. They didn't know a lot about the rare third haki, but they had found out through trial and error that the mysterious power didn't always work the same on everyone. For one, it didn't affect the brothers, whether it was because Ace wasn't directing it to them, or because they were immune like some others, they didn't know. Not only that, but when Ace had tried using it on some of the doctors, namely Hair, it had only made him stumble a bit, not knock him out like it had on other kids they used it on. That being said, the power, while helpful in some cases, was a hit or miss with their experience. Oh, right, Luffy muttered. It was a good thought though, we'll definitely try it tomorrow and see if it works, Sabo said encouragingly, ruffling Luffy's hair and smiling to the youngest. Luffy looked over to the blonde and smiled widely, nodding happily at the fact that he had helped, even if only a little. We should go to sleep then. The faster we can beat this guy up, the faster that crybaby princess can leave her room. Ace said, rolling onto his side, facing away from his brothers in an attempt to fall asleep. Don't call her that when we're around people, please. Sabo groaned, knowing that there would most definitely be a reaction to the words depending on who heard them. He thought Luffy was bad, but now he had to worry about Ace's nicknames. Yeah, whatever. Well guys, that is it for now. Make sure to like and subscribe for a cookie and join the Discord if you want. Anyway, see you guys later.